This battle froze all living things in inexpressible horror. It seemed as if the sky itself had descended to the earth, painted in mournful dark colors. The rocky terrain where the massacre took place was covered with the bodies of dead monsters and people. Everything was mixed together in one heap. Scaly dragons, human remains were burning in the fire, which moved from body to body in cheerful tongues. From the highest cliff, stones danced in the air from magical attacks, and a soft blue glow reached into the sky. The blood of the fallen flowed in streams from the demon's huge, forked blade. The monster was pleased with itself. There was only one human left. The demon seemed to be made of the blazing flame that was his essence, a grin playing on his face as his clawed hand reached out to the man, sensing a quick victory. The demon, without even getting close to the victim, with one movement plunged the sword straight into the man's chest, knocking the victim off his feet. But the weapon the man desperately clutched in his hand had long since shattered into pieces. Blood gushed from the young warrior's mouth and he coughed violently, trying to breathe air through his punctured lungs. The guy, with the last of his strength, rose up on one knee, leaning on the broken sword, and opened his right eye, as if he wanted to destroy the demon with one glance. This world has come to an end. It has been a year since people have been defeated in the war with demons. The human race has remained in the minority in this battle. Violent fires and monsters that amaze the imagination with their incredible size and power destroyed entire cities. The surviving humans became vessels for the birth of monsters. They were buried in layers of webs, like the corpses of tiny insects. But as the last survivor of the resistance, the blonde, stately warrior continued to fight until he met the main demon. From head to toe, clad in hellish armor, with his horned wings folded behind his back, he stared fixedly at the man bowing before him. The warrior knew the one who mortally wounded him. It was Tartaros, the Demon King. Tartaros looked mockingly at the dying man, as if he had just noticed that he was in pain, and offered his help. A yellow light shone on the outstretched claw, and a tangible spell of prolonging life force appeared. It snaked around the boy's body, giving him short moments of rest, because the demon wanted to chat a little with his toy. Tartaros initially addressed the warrior impersonally, but then remembered his name, Jeffir. The king turned around, clasping his hands behind his back, and told him that Jeffir was the first one to bother him so persistently, and praised him for his persistence. They say that he who fights without a chance of winning is foolish. With these words, Tartaros walked past the boy who was gritting his teeth, continuing that those who surrendered, afraid of the enemy's strength, are not wise. Eyes blazing with hellish fire darted towards the man, cutting off the fact that such people are fools. Tartaros bared his teeth. He was incredibly angry when he saw such a weak and impatient trash. Jeffir, the strongest of people, should understand him. The grin faded from the demon's face as he looked down again to offer the boy a daring deal. To switch sides with Tartaros. Together they could leave this filthy land, conquer others, including the abode of enemies with the help of their common strength. With these words, the demon again extended his hand to Jeffir. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the heavy breathing of the man. He let out a long breath, looking down, and asked if Tartaros would really accept him into their ranks. The demon chuckled, the corner of his mouth twitching upward, once again confirming his intention. Jeffir licked the blood from his cracked lip and smiled, saying that it sounded good, but it flashed through his mind that this was complete nonsense. The guy was mortally wounded in this battle. The insidious demon could not help but know that the man could no longer be saved, but still offers to conquer something together, saying that he will give a chance. Isn't this a trick of a heartless monster who just wants to see a desperate young man beg him like a coward? And how can Jeffir beg his enemy who took away his friends and loved ones? With these thoughts, the guy extended his trembling hand to the other man's palm, as if he was ready to do anything for the sake of his life. With each slowly dragging second, the disgusting grin on Tartaros's face grew wider. A female silhouette appeared in front of Jeffir's face. Someone complained about the guy's nasty character, but the woman asked not to swear, because that's what he would have done. The warrior smiled, however. He never listens to anyone, so he will just do one funny spell. His hand stopped shaking and instantly covered the remaining distance to the demon's palm, clinging to it with a death grip. Tartaros, not expecting such a sharp maneuver from the weakened man, stepped back in amazement. Swallowing the blood that was rising to his lips, the guy said that if he did it with his own hand, the force that was beyond his capabilities would simply tear the human body apart. The handshake was illuminated with blue light. Jeffir stared angrily at the devil Tartaros. This was his answer to the offer. With his other hand, the young man showed the monster the middle finger and loudly sent him to hell. A long journey that drunken workers in the city tavern sent each other on in times of peace. If Jafir had found the strength to laugh, he would have been laughing at Tartaros's defenseless, childlike face, staring in surprise at his and the man's palms, from which an incredibly bright light was now emanating. The warrior could only stretch his lips into a caustic smile, while tears flowed from his eyes due to the glow. The demon's body burned brighter than ever, like the largest and most solemn funeral pyre, and then it flared up and exploded. The fire became so large that it stretched for kilometers, and the charred silhouette of Tartaros, which could not move from one place. The monster opened its yellow eyes in shock, looking ahead. Covered in soot, he saw how his hand, which had recently been clutching someone else's palm, became charred and separated from his body. He still stood motionless, his mouth slightly open. The fangs clicked loudly. The eyes became even wider. Only one thought swarmed in the head. What happened to the hand? Time sped up again as Tartaros realized what had happened, his face twisting into a grimace of incredible anger. There was a deafening cry from the demon who had been so insidiously deceived by man. He sank helplessly onto the hot ground, unable to do anything. Tartaros was burned and charred, leaving only thin membranous threads from his once majestic wings. With all the curses known to the monster, he cursed this rotten little man Jafir, who dared to deceive us. Let this freak's mother give birth to him again. With a furious cry, Tartaros swung his fist and slammed it into the stone block with all his might. The blow was decisive, and the demon's charred body crumbled into many pieces. This is how the battle of the last man ended, who could not avenge the people dear to him. He burned, unable to protect everyone as he promised. Everything ended in a shameful defeat, and everything should have been exactly like this. But the fading consciousness returned to the deceased again. Jafir was able to feel his own finger movement. He opened his eyes sharply and cried out in surprise, finding himself whole, lying on a cold floor in some bright space. Thoughts raced through his head about how this could have happened to him, the one who had burned alive in that nightmarish battle. Jafir sat up and began to feel himself, noticing distantly that even the armor is intact, and on his body he did not feel a single wound that he received in the fight with the demons. The warrior had no idea where he was, and there was no one to ask. He sat all alone in a beautiful, majestic hall with high ceilings, huge columns, and 3 statues. The figures depicted gods. Did this mean that the guy ended up in some kind of temple? Was there such a building nearby? My gaze fell on the inscription that was located under the central statue. Jafir narrowed his eyes, reading the symbols carved into the stone several times. He smiled wryly when he finally managed to let what he had read into his confused thoughts clearly: the afterlife. Suddenly, a strange voice rang out in his head, which objected to him. This is not the afterlife, but the lower level of the pantheon, the abode of the gods. In the opening opposite the warrior, from which a bright blue light emanated, a large cloud of energy appeared, resembling a portal. From there, a fair-haired woman in white robes fluttered out, her huge snow-white wings behind her back losing several feathers, which softly landed on the stone floor. She opened her eyes, and framed by completely white eyelashes, the woman's gaze was as innocent as that of a newborn child. Jafir remembered the main rule: do not trust anyone, and immediately instinctively reached behind his back with his right hand to grab his sword. But everything did not go according to plan. He realized with concern that the weapon was not being summoned. The palm grabbed onto emptiness. The man had nothing to defend himself with in case of an attack. The woman, flapping her 2 pairs of wings for the last time, told Jafir that he had nothing to be surprised about. She, the eldest angel Mercedes, had come to convey to him the will of the gods. The warrior is dead, and following the procedure, the angel is obliged to send him straight to the underworld. But everything was not so simple. Due to persistent requests from several gods, the 3 supreme gods decided to send Jafir into the past. The warrior's thick white eyebrows drew together as he asked Mercedes what this meant. The woman explained that he would be sent back in time with all his memories, meaning that the boy had a chance to change the outcome of the battle. And although he will return to the past along with his memories, Jafir will not have all of his acquired skills, magic, and endurance. Mercedes' face was expressionless as she added dispassionately that the young man had once already become the one who had climbed to the top of the human pyramid. Jafir narrowed his eyes warily when he heard that it wouldn't be difficult for him to restore everything again. He still couldn't figure out if he was in a dream, since Tartaros, as far as he knew, didn't have the art of illusion, or if this was just death euphoria. The guy exhaled heavily, placing his hands on his hips, thinking about what the angel had said. Straightening up, Jafir asked why they decided to give him such a chance. Mercedes raised her hand, agreeing that it was hard to believe, but she could provide evidence that would help. The guy waved his hand, interrupting the angel. Let's say he would believe. but he just had no idea yet what he should do. After all, in the world you always have to pay for everything. It turns out that the gods need something, so he is given such a unique chance. When demons were killing people by the thousands, people prayed with all their hearts. The gods cut off contact with the world, did not answer prayers, and did not accept offerings. Moreover, they took away the powers of the priests, who could fight by borrowing the power of the gods. Thus, the human army, having lost its defensive and healing skills, was instantly defeated. Zephyr wasn't going to believe the angel's sweet words, because the gods abandoned the human race as soon as they realized that they would not get anything more on Earth. Such calculating freaks can't just give a chance. As if having overheard the man's thoughts, the angel obediently lowered her eyes, saying that she would convey to him the will of the gods. Blue Eyes looked straight at the guy, suddenly flashing dangerously. From Mercedes' body came a roar. Forming the speech of many gods, they demanded more bread and circuses from man. Upon hearing this, Zephyr's face darkened in rage. How dare those bastards? The young man's eyes fixed on the woman's figure, and he asked again, hoping that he had imagined it. Mercedes easily reported that the gods who had turned their attention to the guy felt sorry for his life, because it was rare to meet a person who would go so firmly to the end when only death lay ahead of him. The veins on Zephyr's temples bulged with anger. As soon as he heard how the battle with numerous monsters, which he had been waging for 5 long years, seemed very interesting to the gods. Many gods would be upset if everything ended too quickly. So they watched the man. He should remember that closer to the end, he was lucky more and more often. Mercedes barely had time to report that the gods were helping the warrior until he paid for something, when a bright stream of light flew at the angel. She silently took a step to the side, dodging the attack of the maddened Zephyr. The columns in the hall collapsed from his furious force. The warrior cursed filthily at the angel. Well, it turns out the gods were having fun. The guy lost his dearly loved ones in that battle, and he still feels their touch on his skin. They fought so desperately with the monsters because they wanted one thing, to live. And now the gods are telling us that they found it interesting and fun? Zephyr screamed furiously, clenching his fist to summon another round of magic spells. Did the gods really think he was fighting to amuse them? Was this really a puppet show? Mercedes, with an unreadable look, held out her palm with a divine spell, pointing it at the guy. The tangible figure of the spell rose up, and from there appeared the foot of a giant, chained in golden chains. Zephyr felt an inhuman force pressing down on him, pulling him towards the floor. He couldn't stand it for even a second before his knees buckled under the weight. The giant moved his foot and crushed Zephyr like a disobedient bug. Mercedes extended her hand again, slightly lifting her foot off the ground. And with this, the destroyed slabs moved apart. Coming closer to the kneeling boy, she quietly asked him to be polite, because the gods were watching them. Mercedes leaned toward Zephyr, resting her hands on her knees, and told the warrior, who was shaking with tension, that it seemed he had not understood her thought. When the gods said, "interesting," they meant only one guy, and were not at all interested in humans as a race. Angel lifted Zephyr's chin, and he bared his teeth in disgust. A strange light of madness lit up her eyes, which frightened the warrior for a moment. But Mercedes said that if he proved his worth, he would get what he wanted. It could be something for him personally, or for all people. It didn't matter. The young man understood that he had no way out, not a single option to change his fate, and in impotent anger he froze under the weight of the giant. After all, as the angel said, you always have to pay for everything. The woman wanted to add something else, and snapped her fingers. The giant's leg disappeared, allowing the man to breathe deeply again. It turns out that among all of them, there was a god who persistently asked to return the guy to the past for another reason. Zephyr raised his head sharply, vaguely guessing whose hated name he was about to hear. In the pantheon, walls exploded and furniture flew from Tartaros's devilish fury. While one of his hands was bandaged, the second demon threw pieces of columns at the workers who processed divine requests. So much did Tartaros not want to wait for a chance to deal with a man. Everything around him was burning with his anger. The demon who had acquired more than 10 worlds was knocked out because of some youngster. Enough jokes. He urgently needed to make sure that all this did not happen. Zephyr dropped his hands helplessly, sitting on the stone, and looked at this depressing picture, because the angel showed in the magic mirror what the demon was doing. The devil Tartaros, the god of destruction who destroyed 10 worlds, his goal is to destroy all worlds. Up until this point, he has never lost. He is a warrior who has never been injured. Mercedes, as if with some kind of reproach, turned to the guy, saying that he had ruined his service record. He had hurt his pride so much. Zephyr cursed under his breath. Was it really for this reason that this crazy bastard was destroying the pantheon right now? It turns out that the devil wants to fight man again in order to achieve a clear victory. The angel, humbly folding her palms in front of her, looked slyly at the guy, asking what his thoughts were on this matter. The corner of Jeffer's lips twitched and a laugh escaped his mouth. The warrior clenched his fist, the leather of his gloves creaking in the silence of the room. It was such an obvious question. Standing on his feet, Jafir smiled openly. Since the devil wanted to die, he would have to fulfill his request. Mercedes began the ritual, placing the man in a charmed circle. She said that the point of arrival would be random. Jeffer would have enough time to restore his strength. In addition, the gods wanted to give him a gift. The young man would be able to check it immediately upon arrival. Looking somewhere ahead, Jafir thought, even though these gods are disgusting, there is still a chance, and he can use it to take revenge not only on Tartaros, but on all the gods who abandoned humanity. And so, the location has been chosen. Confirmation of the constellation, for space-time movement, confirmation received. Still emotionless, Mercedes glanced at Jafir and wished him luck, expressing the hope that he would find it interesting. She recited a prayer, and the rune circle multiplied, shone brightly in space and quickly began to spin. Jafir gradually disappeared in this glow. At first there was emptiness. A little later the guy began to hear voices, and then, opening his eyes, he saw male silhouettes. Jafir blinked, and the next moment he saw several shirtless men more clearly. They cursed foully, frightened that the guy was not breathing, and again the saving darkness. But someone began to persistently call him newbie, shake him, and demand that he wake up. Jaffer suddenly opened his eyes. Water poured onto my head and my wet hair again blocked my entire view. Finally, Jaffer woke up, finding himself in a cave, surrounded by men with strange tattoos on their shoulders. The one who poured water on him seemed to be glad that he woke up, assuring his comrades that he did not kill the guy who had just woken up. Decorated. The scarred face looked at the former warrior with a silly smile, splashing the last drops of water from the windskin. He looked around at those present, long-forgotten images floating from his memory, reminding him of the distinctly familiar faces of the guys who were looking at him with barely concealed malice and wide, evil smiles. My gaze stopped on a strange tattoo on the chest of the guy opposite. A cross, circled exactly in the middle. That was that very brand. Finally, he remembered, and covering his face with his hand, he coughed loudly, bursting into laughter, causing the men to be perplexed. Why did he go back exactly 10 years to his 20 years? His comrades kept their mocking glances at the guy. One of them had a pickaxe in his hands. Jeffer returned to the time when he served in the temple as a slave. A man appeared not far from them, shining a lantern on the way. He was the leader of the group, and rudely asked what was going on, then ordered them to end their rest and return to their workplaces. Jeffer was still sitting on the cold ground when, apparently, the leader of the group of men cast a frontal glance at him, cursed, and threatened to kill him if he interfered again. The former warrior fearlessly turned his head, asking again what his comrade had blurted out. The man, who had managed to move away, was about to pounce on the blonde again with his fists, but his friends pulled him away, while Jafir indifferently rubbed his face with his hands. He didn't even want to worry about such scum. He looked around in surprise when he heard a thin, childish groan nearby. The child weakly thanked the guy for standing up for him, but he had absolutely no memory of how exactly Jafir had helped this child. Shrugging, the former warrior grabbed the free pickaxe and trudged further down the tunnel, not saying anything to the small stranger, leaving him sitting on the floor, confused. It would take the boy a while to adjust. It was harder to walk in old, torn boots than in his usual armor. After taking a few steps, the young man suddenly remembered another of Mercedes's words. She had promised him a gift from the gods. An image of an angel appeared before my eyes, who said that the gift could be used if I said the phrase, "Open a special advantage." Jafir hid behind a large rock, waiting until the child, heavily dragging a pickaxe behind him, went further into the tunnel to the others. After waiting a few more seconds, Jafir, trying to speak as quietly as possible, said the necessary words. A bright yellow glow appeared where he stood, engulfing his body like a snake. Realizing what was about to happen, the former warrior straightened up abruptly. He certainly didn't expect this. A sly smile played on the guy's lips, anticipating something unusual. Crazy. His gaze resembled the expression on the face of a gold prospector. Here it is, the treasure that belongs only to him. When the former warrior got to work, the other slaves were so amazed by his skills that they even stopped digging the rock. They talked to each other, discussing the newcomer. Maybe he was a miner? The speed of the boy's work was especially noted. The pick in his strong hands rose and fell so quickly that sometimes it was impossible to discern the sequence of movements. After some time, several bags were filled to the brim with black pieces of coal. Those same men, having seen enough, went to another part of the tunnel, one dreaming that Jeffir was in their team, the second swearing that now they would have to work just as painstakingly. But the guy was busy working hard and was occupied with completely different thoughts. He still could believe that you received it for free in such circumstances. In his mind, he kept returning to those happy moments when he discovered the special advantage. After the main phrase, Jeffir's head split from pain, he grabbed his forehead, realizing that all the information instantly appeared in his mind. The guy's eyes widened in shock. This was something different, unlike anything he had ever seen before. This was the repository of all the best skills. The lightsaber skill, the iron wall, rebirth, and that was only a small part, including those he didn't have before. Jeffir even laughed nervously. How could these stingy gods just give him such treasures? The guy was brought out of his thoughts by the menacing cry of the same worker who had been shouting at the workers at the beginning. He noticed that the slave was standing by the wall of the tunnel, staring at one point. The man angrily walked towards the former warrior, shouting that he had ordered everyone to return to work. He was a head shorter than Jeffir, and yet, feeling himself unpunished, he threatened the blonde with lashes on his first day of work. The whip itself he was clutching in his hand. The warrior turned his head, recognizing the person shouting. It was the head of the mining brigade. He grabbed hold of whip, cursing at the slaves, calling them stupid bastards who never understand in a good way. The man, with a bestial expression on his face, swung the whip with all his might, shouting that he would now teach the boy to listen. A loud whistle was heard, but the weapon did not fall on the slave's body. He caught the end of the whip with his bare hands, without moving from the spot. The boss froze in place, raising his head. He peered into the worker's face, amazed that the guy was able to catch the whip with his hand. To his great surprise, the worker extended the end to him, bowing respectfully and asking for forgiveness, promising to return to work immediately. While the boss, like a big fish, opened and closed his mouth, Jeffir left him and went to his workplace, silently examining his palm. Thanks to his past combat experience, the young man saw every tiny movement. Guns, but there wasn't a scratch left on him. The palm with which he had grabbed the whip was unharmed, only the bandages wrapped around his hand torn. Special ability number 1, the skill Iron Wall, significantly increases defensive skills, completely absorbs damage below the owner's own defense level, guarantees high endurance. Jeffir realized with satisfaction that he didn't feel tired at all. He could have worked like that all day long. The pickaxe clanged as it hit the hard rock. Although the conditions were bad if used correctly, this skill was very useful. The boy thought while working that he had received only 9 special abilities, and if he also took into account his knowledge of the future, he would be able to quickly regain his strength. With these thoughts, he threw sacks filled to the brim with coal in front of the man keeping records. Jeffir continued to add more and more bags to this pile. Considering that there were more than 10 of them, the man stuttered as he praised the boy for a job well done. At the end of the working day, all the slaves gathered in the square, where the boss announced their rating. In first place was the F team, which included Jeffir. Hearing a delighted squeak next to him, he realized that he was in the same team as the baby. Team B came in second place, and their offenders looked askance at the winners, wondering how they had managed to take first place. The third place was taken by the Team H. Its members began to dance with happiness, but the remaining Team E, which took the last place, was not so lucky. Its members burst into tears, falling to their knees. The boss explained that, according to the rules of the mine, the money and products of the last team are distributed among the first, second, and third places. Jeffir glanced at the group of unfortunates whose property would soon be distributed to strangers. The chief ordered to pray to the great goddess Arya, and all the slaves present instantly fell to their knees, raising their hands to the heavens, and began to praise the goddess, asking her for salvation with their eternal light. Jeffir, watching this mass madness, continued to stand calmly, mentally blaspheming in the most indecent forms. On the continent, among the 3 great deities, the goddess of light Arya, who was depicted as a beautiful warrior clad from head to toe in armor, was the most worshipped, and she was also the greatest creditor. Almost everyone who lived here had lost their home because of the monsters, so all the slaves, groaning from the weight of the day spent in the mines, dreamed of getting to bed as soon as possible. Or, like Jeffir, they were adventurers. But after the temple saved them from death, they ended up in slavery to pay off a huge debt for treatment. It all came down to the fact that while a person has a stigma slave, he will not be able to move freely, because if you go beyond the limits without permission, the person's heart will quickly stop. Jeffir knew that he needed to pay off what he owed as soon as possible and regain his freedom. Tartaros wouldn't get off so easily this time. The guy, wandering wherever his eyes looked, clenched his teeth in anger, remembering the devil. He would take revenge, no matter what. Before my eyes flashed the touch of thin hands, so familiar to the point of pain, so familiar to the point of mental anguish. How the beautiful face moves away from him, begging for help, unable to reach. Finally, having resigned herself, the beautiful eyes opposite fill with tears and a gentle smile freezes on the lips. Jeffir, his eyes clouded by his own tears, extended his hand in response as if in a fog. It becomes so painful and heavy in her chest that she has to cover it with her palm, so that her heart doesn't burst out. His Alteo, he will be able to protect her. His legs brought Jeffir to the square. At the entrance stood a church worker in a long white and gold robe. She pointed somewhere in the direction where one could visit a store or confess. There, the townspeople and slaves gathered to drink beer and eat baked potatoes after the grueling work. The former warrior glanced at the local prices. A mug of beer cost 80 silver coins. Looking into one of the shops where the locals eagerly bought mugs of beer and sausages, Jeffir thought that he hadn't seen such idiotic prices for a long time. He was brought out of his reverie by the same familiar childish voice. The child from the mine was offering to treat Uncle Jeffir to some beer. He looked back and asked rather rudely if his colleague had a lot of money. There were several silver coins in the little hand. The baby squeaked that he had just received the coins, although he wouldn't be able to buy anything expensive. The child pressed the coins to his chest, reminding him that Jeffir had protected him in the mine, and that thanks to him, their team had taken first place. The boy looked down, smiled, and added that the team was made up of weaklings, and they usually took the last places, so you could say that this was the first time he had received money. Jeffir looked at the boy carefully, his head bowed, and immediately understood why he was being beaten like that. After all, if at least one miner from the group falls ill and cannot work, then the efficiency of the entire team drops sharply. Having sabotaged at least one team in this way, the team in which the offender is a member automatically rises to a higher position. Jeffir turned around and waved his hand dismissively, replying that he would not eat the child. The boy muttered something in response, but the guy thought that he was doing this on purpose to make him feel sorry for him. Let him not bother him with all sorts of nonsense. He would only get on his nerves. The former warrior approached another shop, where a friendly salesman was polishing beer glasses, greeting a potential customer. Without responding to the greeting, Jeffir asked if the shop sold a restorative potion, causing the man to become slightly confused. Scratching his bald head under his kerchief, his expression immediately changed, asking the newcomer if he had any money. 1 gold coin for a glass, 4 for a bottle. But if the slave doesn't howl in pain, then it would be better for him to endure it. Without answering, the guy poured several coins onto the counter. 1.5 gold coins. Smiling, Jeffir said that he would borrow the rest and ask the seller for a receipt, which he was going to sign. His words shocked the boy standing behind him. He, sweating and stuttering, tried to call his uncle to reason. Seeing how the seller quickly put his stamp on the receipt with Jeffir's signature, the child rightly asked if he had gone crazy. While the young man emptied another bottle of potion, the kid screamed and explained to Jeffir what would happen if he couldn't pay his debts. He had no stable income, he couldn't go into the red, and the interest on the additional loan was terribly high. Throwing his head back for another sip, the blonde glanced sideways at the boy, assuring him that he would also pay off the ill-fated interest. Recovery is a popular product that restores stamina. If you drink a large amount of it, you can get a hidden effect, an increase in magical energy, and the former warrior knew about it. But even after drinking 10 bottles, the effectiveness remains low. But not in the case when a person has a special ability, the skill, Secret of Hermes. It improves the effectiveness of any potions. Jeffir understood that he would not earn much money in the mine. Even if he worked as hard as he could, he should not expect a good reward. The last empty bottle is Loudrang when the guy dropped her into the pile with the others. The potion really helped. With each workout, the guy improved his physical strength. There was a need to find a way out of this situation in an unconventional way. So the blonde man came to the mine manager and reported that he had heard a howl in the mine itself. He received this news with alarm, and then Jeffir asked him to inform the hunters about it so that he could lead them to the place where he heard the sounds. The answer to the question, what to do, was, money can be earned in the dungeon. Monsters are creatures generated by the magical flow. Many of them are aggressive and pose a great threat to people. And although these creatures suffered great damage during all the years of war, their appearance became a help for humanity. Magic crystals and stones inside the monsters' bodies, as well as skin and bones, served as excellent material for creating weapons and armor. As a result, monsters quickly came to be seen as a valuable resource. Each cave in which these reptiles lived concealed both great danger and great profit. After some time, guests actually arrived to see the mine manager. 3 of the best monster hunters, tall young men in armor and long robes, walked along the ground, carrying heavy weapons in their hands. Hunters are slaves with martial skills, selected specifically to deal with monster problems. The price for their work is as high as the risk of the hunt, and the success of the mission often predicts an additional fee. Folding his arms across his chest, Jafir thought resentfully about why an adventurer like him had been assigned to the miners. When he went to the bank where he usually took out a loan for the potion, he was rudely refused a loan. When asked whether the daily limit had been exceeded, the man lamented that Jafir's rank was too low and he would not receive another penny. When the blonde man was thinking about whether he should take money from someone, a church worker, who had heard the entire conversation well, ran up to him. She, smiling sweetly, offered the guy to open a line of credit if he sold his internal organs, since the temple buys these organs for scientific research. The girl had all the documents with her, which Jafir began to study carefully. The operation would be scheduled for the next week. If he returned the proceeds, he would be able to cancel the operation. The creditor twirled his finger at his temple when he watched these two. Having handed the man a paper, Jafir ordered that all the money be spent on bringing the restorer. The seller, carrying boxes of bottles, maliciously muttered that he didn't care about the madman's future fate. With her hands folded in a prayerful gesture, the church worker sighed in admiration, almost calling the guy crazy, but came to her senses in time, calling him a real man. When the last empty bottle fell to the floor with a clang, the girl was amazed yelped. She had never seen so many containers of restorative in her life. The blonde smiled with satisfaction, feeling with his whole being that he was truly ready. The sound of a spear tip hitting the asphalt was heard next to him. Straightening up, Jeffer saw a hunter greeting him, who asked if he was the guy who would accompany them. The blonde smiled and nodded, glad that the hunters had arrived just in time. The guy, the head of the reconnaissance group, introduced himself. His name was Goth, and the other two were Dale and Marco. Jeffer shook the outstretched hand, saying that he had no night vision skills, but he could use a magical pulse, and he also expressed hope that their small team would work well together. Night vision is a skill that allows you to see in complete darkness. The magical pulse sharpens perception due to the released energy. These skills are necessary if a person wants to penetrate the lair of monsters unnoticed. Goth adjusted his helmet, thought that the price for the night vision potion was high, and then suggested out loud that they move out if everyone was ready. Goth and Dale went forward, the latter not missing the chance to laugh at the miner who uses a magical pulse. Marco, with a sledgehammer over his shoulder, roughly ordered Jeffer to take the luggage. The blonde listened indifferently to how Dale couldn't calm down, mocking the slave, who apparently thought he was going to crush the lair with them, but God immediately asked him to shut up. This didn't bother Jeffir. Later, everything would fall into place, especially since he doesn't know 2 of them, but he's definitely familiar with one. He was transferred to the hunters a month after the cave was cleared out, and 2 people died under its arches that time. The guy smiled. It seemed like he had figured out how he could use these guys. Goth, breathing heavily, stepped onto the last stone of the forest staircase. He exhaled heavily, leaning on a long spear behind the man. Following, the rest of the hunters and Jeffer followed. At the entrance to the cave, they were met by several figures in cloaks with deep hoods. One of them, with a mask on his face and glasses flashing, called himself a support group and asked everyone to stretch their hands forward. The man began to tie a special rope around the wrist of each participant in the expedition. Even Jeffer, who was puzzled by such care, got such a rope. The man showed his wrist, which had 4 of the same magic bracelets. If something happens to the hunters, the bracelets on his hand will break, and the support group will be able to immediately request help from the main headquarters. When the hunters entered the cave with the blonde man, the man shouted out his hope that he wouldn't have to call anyone, so let them concentrate and do their job cleanly. As an escort, Jeffir went ahead of the entire group of hunters. No one objected, and everyone continued walking in complete silence. The footsteps of people echoed loudly in the silence of the long tunnel of the cave. After some time, a flashing light appeared at the end of the tunnel, and the shadows on the walls began to dance. Someone's paw, scratching the stones on the ground with long claws, took a step forward. 2 monsters with human habits walked along the passage, holding torches and long daggers in their paws, and they themselves were dressed in torn loincloths. One of them, with its mouth open, stared at the wall, into which a pebble had flown from somewhere on the side. Both monsters stared at the lying stone, turning their heads like animals and baring their teeth. Hunters immediately appeared behind their backs like shadows. Goth immediately jumped up to one of the monsters, grabbed it by the mouth and ran his sword across its throat. The main task of the reconnaissance group is to detect monsters and collect information about the lair. Dale dealt with the second monster, plunging his sword into its head. Then, smiling, sheathing his weapon, he examined the corpses of the creatures. Based on the collected data, a cleanup group is formed which cuts out all the evil spirits. This is the standard sequence of such missions. Jafir pointed in the right direction and was the first to climb into the narrow space of the cave, seeing a small recess there in which he could rest. The hunters assumed that the monsters they encountered were those that survived the last time. Gott said there was another lair on the other side of the mine entrance. Teams A and B had cleared it out last week. Dale assumed the surviving monsters had dug a tunnel and were hiding in it. As expected, the reconnaissance team had good skills, so an inspired Goth began drawing a diagram in the sand with a dagger. Turning to Dale and Marco, raising his visor, he smiled, offering to deal with the monsters themselves. If the scouts decided that they could handle the cleanup on their own, they would enter the battle without orders. The guys' mouths opened in surprise. They didn't expect everything to happen so quickly. Frowning, Dale told the commander that they could just scout out the situation and not put themselves in danger. He continued that it was too risky. What if there was a whole group of monsters lurking there, and there were only 3 of them? Gott corrected him. There were 4 of them. All that was needed was to grab the kobold. Dale nervously pointed his finger at Jafir, exclaiming that the commander must be joking. Were they really going to fight this porter? Marco patted him on the shoulder, urging him to calm down, then turned to the commander, suggesting that they first listen to his plan and only then decide something. Goth glanced at the other hunters with a sly look and smiled. He turned to Jafir, asking him to get something from his bag, and he nodded, fulfilling the request. When the porter took out several branches with red berries and placed them on the ground, the hunter explained that these were the fruits and leaves of the actinidia. Dale covered his face with his hand and gagged as the blonde man began to crush the berries in a wooden bowl with a mortar. In this case, you can get the smell of cobalt females during the period of estrus. The smell, according to Goth, is quite strong. The creatures can smell it from more than 100 meters away. Indeed, at the other end of the cave, the kobold stopped and began to sniff carefully, forgetting about everything else in the world. As the foul smell filled his nostrils, thick saliva flowed from the monster's mouth and he licked his lips carnivorously. Goth, smiling slyly, covered his mouth with his hand and waved a bowl of crushed berries through the air, spreading the aroma. A kobold, maddened with lust, was rushing towards them from the tunnel at full speed. Finally, approaching, he howled in surprise when his limbs touched not solid ground, but small branches. Thus, a group of hunters managed to trick the beast into a trap. Kobold barked, like an offended dog, and fell into a deep hole. There he said goodbye to life, because the bottom was covered with thick and sharp wooden stakes, on which the rest of the monster's brothers had already been impaled. Gott smiled triumphantly at his comrades, because he said that everything would work out. They praised the commander's decision. The man beamed with self-satisfaction, and when asked when he had prepared this, he replied that it was all life experience. Jafir watched him silently, since it was he who had advised the hunter. In his past life, after the boy was transferred to the hunters, he was on the same team with Goth. He sought recognition from other hunters, but he never got the chance, until he met a former warrior. Goth froze with wineskin water in his hands, asking Jafir in surprise if the road to the cave was clear. Even before the commander had carried out his supposed plan, the porter called him over to tell him something. The blonde admitted that he had already gone down to the place where the monsters were supposed to be, and there was a small lair of surviving kobolds. The hunter was surprised, asking if the ordinary miner was too self-confident, but he replied that before coming here, he was responsible for reconnaissance in his team, Skate Jafira, to look for secret paths. Gott scratched his chin, thinking, if the newbie says that they can handle it just the 4 of them, then we can try to follow his plan? The blonde replied that the decision would be up to the commander, but he thought it was definitely worth a try. Gott, turning his back to the guy, smiled easily. This place could bring them good money. It would be a pity to share with others. The hunter thought that this Jafir was not as useless as he seemed. Incidentally, actinidia is not easy to find, but their carrier is well-trained and seems to be well acquainted with monster hunting. The hunter's smile widened as he realized how much pleasure he was getting from knowing he was superior, since Jafir had left the decision to his superior. The man decided that, as a commander, he would put in a good word for the guy, and he would quickly be transferred to the hunters. Calling the blonde to him, Goth handed him a dagger. He thanked him, clutching the weapon tightly in his hands. Goth winked at the guy, deciding that everything the newbie did, he did on purpose to look better in front of him. However, what difference does it make? In any case, his aspiration is commendable, and the hunter did not consider himself a complete scum. He should not worry about some lair of kobolds. Having thrust his spear into the monster's neck, he was determined to take from this cave everything it could give. Sharply pulling the tip out of the kobold's flesh, Goth loudly announced that they had dealt with most of the creatures. Marco, deftly handling the kobolds with his hammer, was openly having fun. He didn't think it would be so easy and fun. His boss was looking at a small blue stone. It was a pity that there were so few of them. Jafir had just emerged from a narrow passage he had been examining for monsters and reported that it was clear. Goth wanted to give another order, when suddenly Dale's voice was heard in one of the still unexplored passages, right at the entrance. He noticed something. The guy crouched down to get a better look at the find. A pile of small bones. Or maybe they were just remains. Grabbing the remains of someone's paw with his fingertips, he couldn't understand what it was. And it didn't look like a wild animal. Just as he realized that these were cobalt bones, two burning red lights appeared from the depths of the cave. Then a huge clawed paw, like someone's deadly weapon, protruded from the passage. Apparently, a monster of considerable size had been hiding for a long time and immediately grabbed the man, holding him in its claws. He was so shocked that he didn't even try to free himself, while the monster's hand forced its way through, widening the passage with its own body. Goth desperately shouted his partner's name, realizing that he couldn't help him in any way. But the monster apparently changed its mind about killing and threw the man away from itself, trying to get out. Dale, like a rag doll, instantly flew in the opposite direction. He let out a strangled wheeze as he slammed into the hard wall of the cave with all his might. Marco screamed at the top of his lungs. The hammer in his hands heated up and began to glow red. A round symbol appeared on the handle, and the man ran forward, ordering the others to take cover behind him. He grimaced at the realization of how wrong he had been. He thought that everything was over, so what was hidden there? The hunter quickly explained that the symbol on his weapon was a magical shield that would stop even the orc chieftain. This monster should not be able to break through the defense. Marco didn't expect at all that the monster's long, pointed tail would stick out from the passage and knock him off his feet along with his vaunted shield. The blow caused blood to gush from the man's mouth and he began to cough violently. How could it be that his shield couldn't withstand it? The bright blue tail continued to wriggle like a whip, striking the man with more blows. Goth looked at this in horror, shouting the name of his colleague. Stunned by the shock that had overwhelmed him, the hunter realized who the tail belonged to. Meanwhile, having finished with Marco, the monster's limbs switched to Goth. He looked at the approaching death with huge eyes, as if in slow motion. A new batch of hot human blood gushed onto the walls of the cave, and a loud and drawn-out cry of horror and pain was heard. Meanwhile, the support group at the entrance to the cave seemed to be going according to plan. But finally, the man in glasses noticed his wrist and swore in shock. His magic bracelets. If something happens to the group of hunters, they will break right on his arm. So why the hell did 3 of them break at once now? He turned around in horror, sweat pouring down his face under the mask. What was going on there? Meanwhile, the hunter's blood was flooding the ground in their shelter. The Goth, whose torn bracelet hung from his wrist and whose armor was in great disrepair, whimpered like a child. Clutching his wounded and bloody shoulder, he, covered in sweat and blood, barely found the strength to raise his head. In front of him, without a single scratch and without a gun, stood their porter, Jafir, in a fighting stance, covering the commander with his body. No one knew that he was using the Iron Wall skill. It increased defensive functions, completely absorbed damage below the owner's own defense level, and guaranteed high endurance. However, raising his hand and looking closely at his wrist, the guy realized that the monster had broken through his defense, even with the Iron Wall. Jeffrey's worried of myself, but he wasn't even a year old yet, so I thought it wouldn't be easy with this monster. The creature used the sharp tip of its tail to crawl towards Dale's unconscious body. The monster grabbed the bloody hunter tightly around the waist and lifted him off the ground. It is unclear whether the man died or whether there was still life within him, because not a sound came from his side. By this time, a huge monster with a strong body and a head with several pairs of eyes and huge teeth had completely cleared the passage to the hunter's haven. Jeffer watched him carefully without moving. It was the Predator, a creature that pretended to be the offspring of other monsters, using its pheromones to grow up and quickly eat its parents. Jafir turned sharply to Goth, asking only out of politeness to borrow his spear, grabbed the weapon. The man hysterically asked what he was going to do. The guy expertly twirled the spear in his hands. Then, straightening up to his full height, he straightened his arm, moving the gun to the side in front of the monster. His mouth immediately stretched into a sly smile. The blonde was about to warm up a little. He spoke softly to the monster, creating a small smoke symbol on his palm. He was going to grant it one last wish. A second later, a small ball could be seen in place of the smoke, and Jafir was already smiling openly, asking how exactly the predator wanted to die. It was her. Special ability number 3. But hitherto, it is unclear what exactly its characteristics are. A magical silhouette of a key, decorated with wings on top, appeared on Jafir's bandaged palm. It was a silver key. It opened the door to the Forgotten Castle. The user could at any time and in any place put and take out various kinds of objects stored in the silver room. At the moment, the key is in the left hand. The next moment, the guy carried 2 objects out of the room, which now rested on his palm. He immediately threw them right on the floor in front of the astonished goth. It was an ordinary-looking rag and the herb Dragon's Heart, a natural tonic that has the effect of calming the state of mind. The former warrior unwound part of the bandage from his hand in order to attach the spear shaft to his hand. Then Jafir asked Goth to step back. He wrapped the end of the bandage tighter around his palm and the handle to make sure everything was secure. The guy took a deep breath and thrust his spear forward, declaring that now the fun part was about to begin. Goth stepped back, shocked, asking what he meant. Seeing the enraged predator rushing straight towards them, the hunter screamed, asking the boy what he was thinking, since he wasn't even a fighter. Having applied the rag thrown to him to the wound, Goth, gritting his teeth, thought that even if he had to die here, he would not hide like a cowardly dog behind the miner's back. He froze abruptly as the space around him seemed to explode and turn a dark bloody color. The monster opened its wide mouth and, flashing countless fangs, roared, leaning on its hind legs. The skill Fear paralyzes the enemy, covering him with fear. This is exactly the trap that Goth found himself in. He fell to the ground, trying to crawl as far away as possible. The hunter trembled like an autumn leaf and remembered the story that the elder had told him long ago. The small town perished in suffering. Houses burned, people and their property burned alive. Men with only pitchforks in their hands tried to protect their relatives, while they did not know where to run, because there was only fire around. Several years ago, a nearby village was attacked by an adult predator, who took the lives of little people with one blow of his tail. He grabbed their bodies in his huge paws, immediately eating their limbs, spraying blood everywhere. Villagers. They watched everything that was happening without even blinking their eyes, and all because their bodies were completely consumed by fear. People watched their loved ones die. Unable to even close their eyes, they could only cry silently. And there was nothing to be done. All that was left was to wait for one's turn to go to one's forefathers. How late Got remembered this, frozen on the floor in a pool of his own comrade's blood. As tears streamed from his eyes, the hunter did not immediately realize that the scenario in his head was different from what he remembered. His vision was clouded with horror, and the man heard only sharp sounds, not understanding what he was looking at all. Finally, he began to discern the silhouettes of the miner's hands, who was skillfully wielding his own hunting spear. Jafir was right at the creature's mouth and fearlessly attacked it, trying to get into its very throat. When the monster got tired of dodging, he was probably planning to make the main attack. A disgusting screech filled the cave, cutting the ears. The blonde jumped back to buy time, then, gaining speed, crossed the space separating him and the predator in a few leaps. The dragon heart, which he managed to chew and spit out the chewed stalk right on the run, really gave the warrior that promised state of mind, freeing him from fear and worries about the predator. Moreover, the guy had a special ability number 2, the Secret of Hermes. It improves the effectiveness of any secret medicines by 500%. As he ran, Jafir thought that among his 9 special abilities, he only had 1 weapon, and in general, it took an incredible amount of mana. So now it was not even worth thinking about using it. The left hand darted through the air, summoning a bottle of green liquid from the silver room. Jafir poured the potent poison of the poisonous king Fade, Varial, onto the tip of the spear. He so inopportunely recalled their last conversation in the castle near the warm fireplace, when Jafir asked the man if he would really so easily reveal to him the recipe that he had been studying all his life. Fade, folding his arms across his chest, shook his head, replying that the world would soon end anyway. There was no point in hiding anything. They will all rot eventually anyway. It's better to use them together. The king added that he still wanted the warrior to be sure to take advantage of. If with the help of his poison there will be at least 1 less creature, then at least someone will be saved. Taking aim, the blonde ran up to the predator and pointed the poisoned tip of the spear at him. An image of Fade appeared before my eyes for a moment. His left side of his face a solid scar, making his crooked smile look even more creepy. He said that he could not wish for more. The spear sank into the skin between the monster's ribs, spraying green poison around. After spinning the weapon several times, Jafir, gritting his teeth, jerked it out of the predator, leaving a huge cut from which the monster's black blood began to spurt like a fountain. Throwing his ugly head back, he let out a heart-rending squeal, sticking out his long tongue. The monster screamed and growled, shaking its head and tail in incredible pain. Because the deadly poison Virial, made from the most common herbs, gets into the blood vessels, spreads throughout the body and destroys internal organs. And of course, it causes hellish pain. After all, the poisonous king was quite the sadist. The traitor still couldn't die and was still trying to touch his offender with his tail. There were 3 minutes left before the poison spread throughout his body. The blonde needed to hold out until that time. Jafir kept raining down new blows on the monster, now with the tip, now with the other. No less sharp tip of the spear. But at some point, luck turned away from the guy, and the predator, dodging, waved his long, dodgy tail. From the sharp and precise blow, the warrior flew back to the wall, holding the weapon tightly in his hands. The monster stood at the other end of the cave on all fours, its back turned to the man from its own blow. Jafir let out a muffled cry as he hit the hard stone hard, nearly damaging his spine. His eyes immediately went dark, but as soon as the guy came to his senses, he froze in horror. With his mouth wide open, the predator ran towards him with all his might, intending to swallow him on the spot. But the blonde wasn't going to give up so easily. With a sly smile, he threw a whole bottle of that very poison into the monster's mouth. Jafir deftly jumped to the side, and the monster, not expecting such a maneuver, buried its muzzle right into the stone wall, biting off pieces from it. Having jumped back, the guy managed to look back. The predator was pulled back. A fountain of blood was gushing from the monster's throat. He roared again from the pain that tore through him, sticking out his tongue, trying to breathe in at least a little air. But Fade's poison was merciless. The blonde counted down the seconds until the predator's death. 2 minutes left, although no, already 1. To escape, he jumped across a small area of the cave. Jafir understood perfectly well that with his current skills, it would be difficult to evade this creature. Therefore, after 1 minute has passed, he either tries to survive until the predator dies, or he would have to gather all the strength he had into one decisive and final blow. The former warrior deftly dodged the slowly dying monster, whose tail continued to actively beat from side to side. The guy suddenly grabbed the tip of the monster's tail with both hands. The next moment, the predator, spraying blood and squealing, threw the man up into the air, still waving his long appendage. Clinging tightly to the creature, Jafir even began to pray to all the gods he knew. He only had to endure a little longer. Finally, he realized that the decisive moment had come, and he let go of his hands. As he fell, Jafir raised his spear over himself with the long tip pointing downwards. He chose the most opportune moment when he was hanging right above the monster's head, and now he was about to plunge the weapon right into its crown. Approaching the cherished point, the guy, not holding back his emotions, let out a warlike cry. A second passed, and the poisonous tip entered one of the predator's many pairs of eyes. The warrior noticed from a distance that it was entering the slimy flesh as if into butter. Now Jafir knew he had to hold on tighter than ever, because the creature roared and threw its head back, trying to throw off this bug that was causing it so much pain. The traitor shook his head so hard that Jafir ducked, letting go of the handle of his spear. It caught on a hanging stone and broke in half, the tip still remaining in the alien's eye. The guy caught the second sharp part and placed it comfortably in his hand. He ducked down again and thrust it into the predator's other eye, wishing him to choke. The next step was the dagger that Goth had kindly given him. Jafir quickly pulled it out of its sheath. Muttering that this was another gift for the monster, the guy took aim. The knife deftly sank into the third eye, smashed that, causing the scarlet liquid to splash out. The monster screamed in pain, the predator's entire body shaking in excruciating convulsions. Stones from the blows of the huge body fell from the walls and ceiling, almost blocking the passage into the cave. Jafir stubbornly held on with his hands as his body jumped in the air along with the monster. The man's nails dug into the vile flesh. The guy did everything to save himself. Finally, he couldn't stand it any longer and slid off the head, hanging with his whole body, holding only onto the hilt of the sword which remained in the monster's eye. The blade slowly sank under his weight, sinking into the mess. Pulling himself up, Jafir deftly pulled out a dagger and struck the monster again. Returning 10 years ago, he lost everything that could have made him better than this monster. He had no strength or magical energy, so he had to prepare like this. restorative. He remembered its properties well, and the hidden effect of drinking a large amount, and the fact that even if you drink a dozen bottles, it will not have any effect. It is necessary to have the special ability Secret of Hermes. Jeffir did everything to gain the magic with which he could crush the predator's skull. The warrior raised his fist over the monster's head, and the man's entire body was illuminated with a soft blue light. He was able to use the magic power management technique. The fist touched the spear and sent out a special discharge, electricity fueled by magic. Such a blow with a bright flash and destructive power fell on the top of the predator's head. It pierced his entire body, all the way to the ground, destroying even the stone floor of the cave. After a few seconds, Goth, who was sitting on his knees, began to chuckle nervously. He remembered with insane pain how he wanted to put in a good word for the miner so that he would be transferred to the hunters. I thought that he was deliberately showing off in front of his superiors to appease them, how he considered himself the best, and that he shouldn't worry about some lair of kobolds. How is he? Screwed up. This guy, even without his help, will quickly gain recognition from other hunters and rise to the top. But now Jafir is a simple miner and cannot go down into the dungeon without permission. If he needed a ticket here, that ticket was Goth. Meanwhile, the warrior, without having received a single wound in the battle, approached the hunter, not taking his eyes off him. They needed to chat. Several miles away, in the forest illuminated by the midday sun, heavy, painful sighs could be heard. Several men lay on the ground, one dead, with a cleaver in his head, the second beaten to the point of blood. He still had the strength to sit up. A tall, strong man with a pointed mace on a chain in his hands was advancing on him. The man crawled away from him, denied his involvement in anything, said it was a misunderstanding. The big man, the church worker, grinned and began to twirl his mace, holding on to the chain, saying that they had entered the temple together. Behind him slowly walked figures in cloaks and with swords in their hands. Unhappy called someone by name, turned to Sahak, asking him to believe him. Tears began to flow from the man's eyes. He sobbed and begged, insisting that he was not worshipping the devil. The warrior standing behind the big guy with a cross on his forehead grinned terribly, his eyes flashing with madness, and immediately ordered the unfortunate man to be killed. The big man didn't need to be asked twice. It was obvious that he took incredible pleasure in killing, because with a bloodthirsty smile he brought his mace down hard on the victim's head. Finally, the devil worshippers were finished off. The bodies lay under the treetops hiding the crushed heads with their shadows. Suddenly, one of the dead men began to tremble strangely. His mouth began to move, and a beetle began to slowly crawl out from there, wriggling its entire body. A few seconds passed before the creature emerged. It turned out to be a long centipede with a red symbol on its small head. Before the insect had time to crawl away, the man in the cloak cut it with a magic sword, causing the centipede to explode in the air. The fighter pulled the sword aside. It was all ablaze with red fire. He, flashing a mad look and licking his dagger, hissed that the insect had already appeared, and he knew for sure that the dead man was a follower of the devil. In the beautifully furnished office, a chandelier sparkled brightly, the rays of the sun shimmering beautifully in its drop-shaped details. An authoritative voice at the table addressed Sahak, who was kneeling, asking if it was one of the seven. Was the probability of what was happening not too low? He had been promised to catch one worm, but in the end, 7 members of the group had been destroyed. The owner of the voice was confronted with parts of a centipede floating in a jar of liquid, and was told that the protest was so serious that they had even burned down the straw houses. Sahak, still kneeling, addressed Inquisitor Matthias, who was sitting at the table. Now that he had removed his hood, one could see wheat-colored hair and the same cross that was applied to slaves. He said that the Inquisitor had heard of their methods. It must be assumed that the rest of the group had already been converted to the faith. The yellow eyes flashed dangerously as the man informed them that there was only a month left until the raid, and if they did not destroy the heretics hiding in the temple soon, they would soon have to pay for them with their own lives. Matthias was silent, deep in thought. He was carefully examining the centipede floating in the jar. Finally, he spoke up, promising to shut up the group of hunters. But in return, the man wanted to see the exact result, and let only Sahak, the trusted person of the Inquisition, try to let them down. He bowed and bared his teeth, saying that he would do everything as ordered. Meanwhile, in the city's Human Resources Department, where Gott brought Jeffer, the girl, a worker in a white uniform, sat at the table and pointed with her hand at the necessary papers to the commander of the reconnaissance group, Mr. Gott. First, he needed to fill out an application to hire this person, in which case, it was necessary to state his name and purpose. The hunter replied that Jeffer was standing next to him, who had started working as a miner this week. The girl replied that she understood and asked to wait 1 second. A little later, she said, smiling sweetly, that if a hunter wants to hire a person from another department, then he becomes a member of his group. And if the mistakes of the hired person lead to a decrease in the effectiveness of the entire group, this can negatively affect the personal assessment in the HR department. When the worker asked God if he agreed to these conditions, the man smiled broadly and nodded. He agreed, absolutely. The man glanced sideways at Jafir. If this guy worked properly, he could take credit for all his achievements. Deep down, God was only pursuing his own benefit. He was incredibly happy that, no matter what, do what you do and come what may. The hunter could not even imagine that he would get such a chance. Just last night in the dungeon, the man was shocked by what he heard from the one who defeated the terrible monster. Opening his mouth, the hunter asked Jafir, who was calmly looking over the predator's corpse, if he was sure that he should pretend that nothing had happened, that he had not killed the monster. Goth was silent for a few seconds, digesting what he had heard, then asked the guy if he was going to take the monster's bodies. Jafir replied that he would leave only the predator and the kobolds, and the miner, casting a sly glance at the hunter, asked him to report that this place was only a lair of kobolds. Monster corpses, magic stones, and items obtained in dungeons are all inaccessible to the temple slaves. After all, everything that the slaves found became the property of the temple itself, and so it was and always will be. The only thing a slave from a group of hunters can have is a reward for cleaning up and bonuses depending on the value of the trophy. So Jafir, knocking his knuckles on the predator, said that he could make good money if he took this carcass to the broker. Got, still pressing the wound with a rag, exclaimed that this was impossible. Didn't the guy know that just for such cases a support group was waiting outside, with whom the hunters had already spoken, and special people would come here to take the trophies? Jeffer smiled and replied that he knew about it. This? But what's the difference? He placed his left palm, the back of which still bore the drawing of the key, on the predator's corpse. Streams of white-blue light burst out from the palm. The magic of the key took effect to take the item into the silver room. There was a product, but now it's gone. With these words, the huge carcass evaporated from the cave, as if it had never been there. The hunter couldn't believe his eyes. He saw with his own eyes how expanded the subspace, which is usually clogged with a couple of things, could be. And then this. Such a big creature disappeared and not even a trace of blood remained. When the silence that had returned dragged on, Jafir spoke the name of the senior hunter. Clenching his left hand into a fist, erasing the remnants of magic, the guy turned his head to the man sitting on the floor and asked if he wanted a promotion. As their small team sat outside the HR department door, Gott leaned his elbows on his knees, swaying slightly from side to side, and thought hard. There were 3 more dungeons to get to. The reward for clearing them could be split between the group members, and here you can take the corpses of monsters for yourself. Clearing dungeons every quarter and the total number of battles can greatly increase the chance of promotion, even if the dungeons are ordinary cobalt lairs. And since his group is a reconnaissance group, the hunters had a lot of battles. Few got stuck in one place for 3 years. The man imagined a bright future. If a skilled hunter joined the group, they would enter the dungeon first and take everything inside without outside interference. Being a small group, they would destroy several dungeons and Goth's reputation as a commander would greatly increase. The man thoughtfully propped his chin up with his fingers clasped together, thinking that he needed a promotion, and Jafir needed money. And this was a great deal. He just needed to hide it poorly, that's all. Jafir was also silent, his arms folded across his chest. He was also lost in his thoughts. He decided that he would be able to cover all his debts when he sold the predator at a good price and, to be honest, he would like to leave the temple as soon as possible. But he still had some business here. The warrior remembered well that in about a month there would be a large-scale raid by the temple knights, during which they would find an item that would shake the entire continent. Jafir needs to get into the raid team by any means necessary and get his hands on that item in order to change the future. Finally, the HR employee announced that Jafir was registered, and from that moment on he belonged to the group of hunters, and he was also entitled to an introductory token and the need to get to the supply department to receive basic equipment. The future hunter, accompanied by his boss, proceeded to the indicated department. They had to cross a long, busy street. The men walked silently along the cobblestones. Jafir thought about how last time he hadn't gotten into the raiding party, since he had risen to the rank of a member of the hunting party after the lists of those participating in the raid had been announced. Since about 20 people will be taken from the group of hunters, therefore, in order to get into the raid group, the guy will have to try hard. He even had a plan, but Jeffer didn't know when exactly he could start implementing it. Got stopped and pointed to the line in the supply department where Jeffer should go, and the hunter himself had to go to the infirmary. He would need to report that Dale and Marco were undergoing treatment. Just as the man was about to add that they could take some things with them, both noticed a group of church people heading their way. Suddenly, for Jafir, Goth grabbed him by the top of his head, forcing him to lower his head down, bowing to the men. The footsteps of a small crowd were heard, and the noise in the street died down. Group of people in long black robes and hoods, among whom was a half-naked giant with a mace in his hand, passed by in a crowd bowing before them. Sakak walked ahead of the whole group. The long hem of his cloak fluttered in the wind. He just passed by Jafir, who obediently lowered his head. The man's eyes suddenly widened, and he himself did not understand why he was so excited. The cloaks passed forward and the hunters raised their heads. Goth exhaled in relief. He explained to Jafir that these people were the Inquisitor of Heresy's authorized agents. They were slaves who were directly subordinate to the Inquisitor. But these are not simple slaves. It is better to treat them as such to the nobles. Under the pretext of searching for heresy, these bastards have the right to kill ordinary slaves without warning. There are rumors of people being cut down just because they accidentally push the Inquisitor's authorized representatives with their shoulders. The craziest of them is Sahak, nicknamed Mad Dog. They say that he started working for the Inquisitor only out of a thirst for killing. If he notices someone, he will go to the end and bite their throat, so Jafir should have kept this in mind. Suddenly, the entire group, which had managed to move far away, stopped, and Sahak, without turning around, shouted something. A second later, the dog turned around sharply, glaring at Goth and his companion. Beads of sweat immediately ran down the man's forehead, and his heart tried to burst out of his chest. Could it be that they heard him? Sahak kept getting closer to them, and as he walked, he began to speak, and he dismissively asked for forgiveness, saying that he was interested in something. Approaching Jeffer, he pointed his finger at the guy who was dressed in miner's rags. The heretic Inquisitor's confidant removed his hood and introduced himself, then asked the miner to state his name and rank. Jafir narrowed his eyes, looking fearlessly at Sahak. Got stuttered out his companion's name, explaining that he had just joined his group and that if there were any problems, he would commander. Mad Dog didn't let him finish, rudely cutting him off mid-sentence. His face instantly lit up with such anger, as if he was ready to incinerate everyone around him with one glance. The man ordered the hunter to shut up, since he was not talking to him. It seemed to go to that the figure of the man in front of him stretched out, that this slave was ready to tear him to pieces, foremouth open at the wrong time. The hunter felt his whole body freeze and his breathing become ragged, as if he saw in front of him not a man, but a predator. What kind of deadly energy was this? Right before the eyes of the crowd of thousands, the leader of the hunting party, who had not been touched by a finger, staggered as if from a blow. Sahak kept his eyes on Jefir, and when he remained standing with his back straight and proud, he was sure of his suspicions. Even when the guy was just standing there, it was immediately obvious that he was not as simple as he might seem at first glance. Others would hardly notice such a thing, but the Inquisitor's confidant had no equal in the acuteness of his feelings. This man is in torn and miner's clothes. He was an incomparable master whose powerful energy, comparable in strength to a dragon, was seething over the edge. Even though he was wearing a miner's outfit, he had just been transferred to the hunter's group. He was originally in the miner's group. New slaves who first arrive at the temple are assigned a place after a skill test. Both physical and magical strength are tested. Those who can fight are given the opportunity to show their skills in action, because the group of hunters is always in need of people. So this slave first worked in the church and then was appointed as a member of the hunting party? All this seemed suspicious and unnatural to Sahak. In the blink of an eye, the entire group of the Inquisitor's slaves disbanded. A few seconds later, without warning, they suddenly surrounded Jafir. This guy seemed to be a strong fighter, but not to the extent that the dog couldn't handle him. The man decided to ask the slave a few questions. He also ordered to answer honestly and not lie, to which Jafir smiled raggedly, thinking that this freak would now regret what he said. And so, the close Inquisitor had some questions for an ordinary hunter. The man approached Jafir, a wide grin on his face. Sahak asked the boy if he had heard anything about worshippers of the demon god. Oh yes, Jeffrey knew about them better. Thangor. The followers of the demon god are people who worship Tartaros, his greatest enemy, traitors to humanity who will lead all people to defeat in the Great War. However, for now, they are known only as heretics, hostile to the current religious order. Slowly approaching the boy, Sahak ingratiatingly explained that these people have several differences from all other people. He said that he had gained recognition for quickly finding these differences, and thus became a subordinate of Master Matthias, the Inquisitor of Heresy. Crazy Eyes measured the figure of Jeffir. Dog said that his instinct told him that the guy was dangerous type. He immediately pulled a long dagger from its sheath and extended his hand forward. Now, as the executive person of the Inquisitor, Sahak will conduct the interrogation, so let the hunter keep in mind that every word or action can be used far from in his favor. After a few seconds of silence, Jeffir asked if he had the opportunity to ask something. Another slave from the group, angered by his actions, almost attacked the guy with a sword, calling him son of a dog, but Sahak waved his hand, allowing Jeffir to speak. He asked if they could change places for a warm conversation. Without taking his dagger away, the Inquisitor's confidant wondered why this was necessary. The hunter noticed with a smile that there were too many spectators gathered here on the street. Staring at Sahak, Jeffir said that he was afraid. You never know. If something indecent happened here, the executive person of the Inquisitor could end up in a very uncomfortable position. The dog's eyes widened in rage. How dare this freak? He chuckled, baring his teeth, noticing that the guy had a lot of confidence since he thought he could handle 5 of them on his own. Saying that the more often he meets such people, the more he feels the benefit of his work, the man got into a fighting stance, ready to attack. Even the air around him became electrified from his energy. A red field in the form of a triangle with various symbols appeared on the paving stones, and Jeffir was in its center. 3 cloaked figures controlled the electrical charge of the field using magical knobs on their daggers. It was a red field skill, the power of abilities located inside the ally's field. The holding time and the boost effect depends on the number of people using the skill. It was activated as a special attribute due to a lack of user understanding. Jeffir narrowed his eyes. He didn't move. He only said that this was already interesting. He tensed his palms and waved them several times. The smile never left the boy's face as he assumed a fighting stance. For a moment it seemed that Sahak was surprised. This combat technique seemed strange to him. He should have observed it first, but any thick-headed idiot might think so. The man laughed and ran, advancing straight towards Jeffir. He didn't care, because inside the red field he was invincible. He pulled his hand with the dagger back, using acceleration. Flashes appeared in the air just before Sahak jumped. A hunter approached him. His palm slid down, his expressionless gaze following the dog. He sharply dodged the attack. Jeffir leaned forward, his palms moving with incredible speed. Another movement almost hit Sahak, passing right over his face. Jeffir ran back, keeping an eye on his enemy. The man twisted and turned, clutching the dagger in his hand. Then he covered the distance between himself and his opponent in a few jumps, putting his leg forward. Sahaka was triumphant and smiled, confident of his victory. But the next moment, the crazy eyes widened in shock. He tried to knock the hunter off his feet with this technique, but he couldn't do it, because the guy's leg didn't even move, as if he was made of iron. To Sahak's great regret, in those seconds that he hesitated, Jeffir managed to group himself. The next moment, blows rained down on the slave as if he was being beaten not by one person but by a huge crowd. The man threw his head back sharply, coughing and choking on his own blood. His hand involuntarily unclenched, the sword falling from his weakened fingers. The hunter took a stance and pulled his bloody fist back, looming over the man. Sahak was lying on the ground unconscious. Got shouted, warning Jeffira of danger to the right. The boy covered his head with his hand when a mace on a chain flew at him. He straightened up, glancing towards the giant who had attacked him. The hunter jumped back, still covering himself with his hand. From a distance, he saw a loutish slave swinging a mace, aiming at the boy. A man with a bloodthirsty face covered in scars called Jeffir to him, demanding that they play together. He smiled, got into a fighting stance, and mockingly shouted at the giant, very surprised that he could talk. Otherwise, it seemed that the man was just a little dog raised by that little idiot. The slave stopped smiling and, screaming furiously, threw the mace, holding onto the chain towards Jeffir. The heavy spiked weapon made a hole in the cobblestones, and the guy managed to run to the side. The people standing on the sides of the street began to fuss in fear, trying to escape the stones flying in all directions. Goth, who thought that nothing could surprise him anymore, was once again amazed by this scary guy. Looking at the unconscious mad dog, he thought about what he had realized back in the dungeons, that Jeffir was no slouch. But this time he had so quickly laid out the Inquisitor's pawn with some strange techniques. Even now, as the big guy named Morningstar Flail pounded the ground with all his might with a mace, Jeffir fought off absolutely all the stones flying at him. A few seconds later, he moved his leg to the side, knocking the mace itself away. Covering his mouth with his hand, God smiled. He would win now, and Sahak himself, when he woke up, would burn with shame, and his pride would not allow him to report this to the higher-ups and provide an arrest warrant. Finally, the man, without even hiding, waved his fist. Let Jafir win, and these freaks will leave him alone and let him not dare lose. Otherwise, they'll grab him and the guy as an accomplice. A stranger in the crowd who stood next to the hunter laughed and cursed, telling Gott that his friend was unlucky. Although the guy fights off all attacks like crazy, his problem started a few minutes ago. Jafir seemed not to notice that Flail was feeding on the power of the field, as was the chain of his weapon. The guy's outstretched arms were immediately wrapped in a magical chain. Trying to extricate himself, he only became more entangled in it. Opposite him stood a smiling giant, clutching his mace tightly. The red field gave the slaves' bodies extraordinary strength. Bending his knee, Flail pulled the long chain towards himself with all his might. Jafir's feet began to slide on the cobblestones, kicking up small stones into the air. But he didn't even allow himself a second's hesitation, without blinking an eye. While the boy was focusing on Flail, a red flash appeared behind him. After all, thanks to the work of the red field, these bastards are getting stronger with every second. And as confirmation of this, a huge cut appeared on Jeffrey's back, and blood spurted out. It was Sahak who woke up and managed to wound the hunter with a dagger. The man hissed happily and announced that the jokes were over. After wiping the alien blood off the dagger, the temple minion said that he would make Jafir regret not asking to be thrown behind bars from the very beginning. Standing in a stance and drawing his dagger back, Sahak turned towards the boy who was still chained up. The man ran towards him using his acceleration. Approaching Jafir, he began to wield the dagger with inhuman speed, appearing in different parts of the field. The guy couldn't catch a glimpse of his opponent while he was flying around him and laughing madly because Jafir couldn't even see him. The next moment, the hunter felt a cut on his cheek. Sahak, running past, looked at him with a grin, boasting that his abilities had now increased by 80%, that no tricks would work against his incredible speed. He continued to cover the warrior's body with more and more cuts, wishing for him to die in agony. Still laughing, he flew straight at Jafir. But the next second, the hunter's clasped fists fell on his head. The blow was so strong that the man was slammed into the asphalt, and many stones flew around. Saliva poured from Sahak's mouth. His eyes rolled back in agony. Grabbing the man's wheat-colored hair, Jafir kneed him in the face. He asked what kind of disgusting teamwork slaves had. Sahak's head fell back. He sprayed blood around himself, his fading consciousness wondering why neither his speed nor his red field defense worked. Finally, the man, with a shameful groan, fell face down on the damaged floor, and Jafir, with his hands tied, spat out that, due to flying like flies, the big guy had already died of boredom. The guy added that if the slave wanted to boast about his speed, he could have done it in a less shameful way. Flail's voice rang out, cursing at Jafir as he pulled on the chains. He ordered the hunter to come to him, and tightened the iron more and more. Jafir straightened up, attracting the big guy's attention with a shout. He strained his palms as hard as he could, asking why Flail wasn't doing anything with her size. The guy smiled and asked if he was afraid to come closer. If his subordinates had shown such teamwork in their past life, Jafir would have finished them off long ago. He pulled the chains towards himself sharply, using the combat method of magic control, amplification. The chains were thrown upwards by such force. Flail fell on his backside, letting go of the mace. She began to knock down the remaining figures that were holding the field in a circle. When the haze cleared, Jafir stood in the street, throwing his chains aside to the astonished gaze of the crowd. Around him, temple slaves lay on the ground, barely conscious. The guy was breathing heavily, looking around at the people. Sahak, barely raising himself on his elbow, covered in wounds, asked Jafir, damn him, who he was and what his true face was. He smiled and replied that he had expected more interesting questions during the man's interrogation. But in the end, that was all he was interested in. Turning his back on the enraged henchmen of the Inquisition, Jafir mockingly said that he had no right to know about this. From the tower window hidden in the shadows, Inquisitor Matthias watched the battle. Long hair fell over the man's shoulders, and he covered his mouth with his hand in shock. Could it be that same person who sent this guy here? Everyone present on the street could not believe their eyes. How was this even possible? Mr. Sahak lost and lay on the ground, hissing angrily and clenching his fists. Sweat beaded thickly onto the damaged floor as the man sobbed. Jafir smiled when he heard Sahak's mad cries behind him, cursing him. The guy thought he was very vocal. So, the first stage of the plan was completed. But the problem was that now the hunter had no idea when what had happened would reach the ears of that freak. Jafir came out to a narrow path by the water. Now the only problem was time. But something was wrong. The guy didn't notice it right away. He froze in shock. Then an incomprehensible force pinned him to the floor, forcing him to sit down. Jafir couldn't move a finger. A sharp pain and powerlessness ran through his entire body. It was a mana freeze. Mana freeze is a condition accompanied by pain and weakness, fatigue, rapid exhaustion, and appears with complete depletion of magical power. After using that technique, Jafir's energy was used up much faster than he expected. Was he really such a weakling 10 years ago, even with an increased magic threshold? The guy cursed because he knew what would happen in that case, the meeting he hated. A purple portal appeared in the sky, which spat out into this world a creature in a golden mask, reminiscent of a carnival mask, and in long, seemingly torn clothes. In its hand it held golden chains that wrapped around its entire body, and at the end of them hung a beautiful-looking bell with patterns engraved on it. The creature loomed over the frozen, bowing boy and introduced itself as the spirit Shylock, a member of the family of Lord Usur, the great god of debt. The slits in the mask where the eyes were glowed purple. The palm reached out to Jafir when Shylock announced that the magic power value had been set to 0, and therefore the collection of the skill Iron Wall began. The warrior gritted his teeth as the voice of the spirit, which seemed to penetrate every cell of his body and sounded everywhere and nowhere at the same time, announced the verdict. But the Iron Wall is not just a skill that increases defense and endurance. Fatigue and damage received from using skills accumulate and turn into debts. And at the moment when the user's magic level reaches 0, the accumulated damage returns to the user. The magic bell becomes 10 times larger and falls on the person, crushing him and instantly killing him. Many adventurers have tried to make this skill convenient for themselves in order to descend into deeper dungeons, but in the end, they all ended up in bankruptcy, that is, death. The god of debts, Asura, a majestic old man on a throne, wearing a carnival mask, lowered his double-edged sword, which devoured the despair of people mired in debt. Jafir was sure that the god was watching him in battle, and choked on saliva from greed. And indeed, under the highest ceiling in his chambers, Asura himself was watching the battle of Jafir. The old man smiled into his thick beard, gently stroking the turtle sitting on his lap, whose shell was covered with precious sapphires. The more fatigue accumulated in the guy, the louder Asura laughed, anticipating a rich harvest. Meanwhile, the spirit, stretching out its long neck, measured the damage accumulated in the user using a special device built into the links of the chain. The chain jingled loudly, and Shylock announced that the measurement was complete and it was time to begin the countdown. 10. The bell descended over the kneeling Jafir, gradually increasing in size. 9. Jafir pressed his palm into the ground, his body becoming too heavy. 8. 7. He had to do something. 6. The warrior cursed under his breath. His body seemed to be glued to the ground. He could do absolutely nothing about it. 5. 4. Jafir relaxed his palm and fell with his whole body to the ground, then began to tear the bandages on his left hand with his teeth. There, a little earlier, he had prudently wrapped a small bottle of restorative potion. A huge coin with the Greek letter Omega depicted on it spun in the air at the number 3. 2. Jafir felt the vile, carnivorous, and anticipatory smile of the greedy god of debts, USR, on his skin. 1. The bell trembled on its thin chain, finally increasing in size, and he flew down like a stone, where the warrior lay sprawled on the ground. At that moment, Jeffrey abruptly pulled the bottle cap towards himself, clinging to it with his teeth, and immediately took a sip of the life-saving liquid. The presence of 1 point of magic has been established. The collection countdown has been cancelled. The bell, raising a pile of dust, suddenly hovered right above the guy's figure, its edges only slightly touching the man's skin. The spirit Shylock inclined his head to one side and in an indifferent voice declared that the debt procedure would have to be postponed until next time. The purple portal closed silently, safely hiding the eerie figure of the spirit within. Jafir, feeling the numbness in his muscles subside, leaned back, breathing heavily, placing his hot left cheek on the cold ground. A sly smile blossomed on his lips. The guy whispered that Asura was a real fool if he thought that the man would not be ready for something like this. In fact, he was a real professional in the field of survival. Jafir lived for a whole year after the extermination of humanity, and it was easy as pie to avoid collecting the god's debts. Additionally, if you manage your mana properly, Iron Wall can be a completely safe skill with the best efficiency. Jafir lay there, as if he was crucified, and tried hard to remember how much this ability had cost in his past life. If he wasn't mistaken, it was around 500 gold coins, a fortune, and plus it was popular among Cretans like Leroy Jenkins. The guy smiled broadly. Such a large sum was beyond his means right now. Jafir raised his hand into the air and extended his middle finger to the clouds, confident that Uzra was watching him. At this moment, the enraged god roared, and with his bare hands squeezed his unfortunate turtle so hard that its shell cracked and shreds of flesh and splashes of blood flew around. Jafir, with a heavy head, could barely open his sleepy eyes. Staring at the semi-dark ceiling, the guy didn't immediately realize that he had been unconscious the whole time. With his clouded consciousness, he could barely discern where he was. Moreover, he did not recognize the room at all. Suddenly, the smiling face of a nun in white and gold robes, already familiar to him, appeared before him, and she joyfully asked if the visitor had slept well and whether he had dreamed of unicorns and butterflies. Jafir tensed up in earnest, fully waking up and realizing that he was lying on someone else's bed with his wrists tightly tied on both sides of his head. He looked down and noticed a bald man pushing a large wooden cart in front of the bed, containing various medical and not-so-medical instruments. Slowly turning his gaze to the nun, Jafir carefully asked her what kind of tricks these were. The girl folded her fingers in front of her and smiled sweetly, saying that her guest must have been very surprised to see an unfamiliar ceiling. But there was no need to worry. It was her workspace. With an even sweeter smile, she reminded him that the debt repayment period had passed an hour ago. The smile suddenly became sinister, and the eyes widened, lit up with a mad fire. The nun asked if the client had become insolent. She rushed to the cart and slowly took a long and very sharp knife from it, continuing to talk about how she heard that the guy was hanging around and doing dangerous things. Didn't Jafir think that his jokes with the collateral had gone too far? The tip of the dagger stopped a few centimeters from the guy's eye when the girl loudly reminded him about the accumulated interest, and that in such a case the temple concludes that the client does not intend to pay at all. Watching how the other person's expression changed abruptly from cute to completely crazy, Jafir involuntarily shuddered. The nun held the knife tightly in her hands, screaming and squealing, asking if the customer would pay. He completely forgot that he owed the temple, and if he uses magic now, the collection will start again. We need to think of something urgently. Swallowing hard, Jafir quickly said that he would receive a reward for clearing the dungeon next week, and that he kindly asked to wait until then. The nun raised the knife higher, hissing that, naturally, they would confiscate these funds. But what to do with the loan for each day, the outstanding interest? Because if this was a kobold dungeon, then the client wanted to slip her 3 coins? Narrowing her eyes, the girl whispered in the same tone, "What should they do? Should they really cut out the guy's insides now?" Turning her head, she called to 2 bald, bare-chested men who were standing nearby, waiting for the command to act. One of them, without asking any unnecessary questions, immediately cut the rope on Jafir's left hand with a sharp knife. Then one man slammed the boy's hand down onto the wooden cart, while the other held his wrist tightly, about to cut off a few fingers. The nun covered her mouth with her hand and suggested starting with the fingers, since the client did not take the temple seriously. But after a couple of cut-off fingers, his opinion would change. Jafir screamed desperately, asking to wait. Besides, he could not remember the necessary name that was on the tip of his tongue. Frowning, the nun took a deep breath and ordered her assistants to cut with all her might. The muscular man didn't bat an eyelid as he swung the sharpest knife. Finally, in such a stressful situation, Jafir remembered the right name. He himself did not understand how it happened, but he managed to open his mouth. It was as if time itself slowed down when the boy said the first syllable. Then came the second, the knife still descending. The mouth opened again for the 3rd syllable. And the last one? Jafir fell silent. And the nun fell silent too. You could see the veins on her forehead bulging as soon as the client said that name. The tip of the knife touched the skin, and a girlish, loud "stop" sounded in the room. The nun was angry as hell, but she understood that now she would no longer be able to carry out her intended threat. She, piercing the hated client with her gaze, could not believe what he had just done. Moreover, seeing the smirk on his face, she stepped back in surprise, loudly asking who he even was. Her assistants froze in surprise. One of them asked his sister what had happened. Her face, darker than the storm, did not express anything good. The girl ordered the men to get out of the room. When they dared to ask again, the nun stunned the assistants with her order, and there was no need to repeat it a 3rd time. While she waited for the door to close behind her assistants, she remained silent, turning her back to the prisoner. Then the girl suddenly leaned over Jafir, hitting the pillow near his head with her palm. Getting close to the client's face, she screamed, ordering him to confess how he knew the name he had said. He, still smiling, whispered how it was possible not to know such a popular person. At first, the guy called her a nun, but then mockingly corrected himself, voicing her nickname, White Rose, a broker of monsters. a nun of the Temple of Light, Anna Primrose, but her second identity is the broker White Rose, who, thanks to connections with the inhabitants of the underworld, acts as an intermediary, conducting transactions with stolen items, equipment, and monster corpses. After all professional hunters know that going on a raid into a dungeon with cheap weapons is the work of a sick person. Watching Anna's furious face, who was literally lying on Jeffer, he thought that he needed to bargain with this girl and get things for himself as quickly as possible. The guy, with a laugh in his voice, thanked Rose for showing him the way to her abode and offered her to untie his hands so they could make a deal. Turning his head, Jeffer saw that it had long since gotten dark outside and suggested that they talk in a more normal setting. Meanwhile, in the city hospital, there was no chance of a peaceful night's sleep. Workers had to dodge flying objects thrown at them by one particularly violent patient. They tried to get closer to the bed of Sakak, who was bandaged from head to toe, gently telling him that he shouldn't be nervous but needed to calm down. The smug face of the hated Jeffer kept appearing before Sahak's eyes, and his last words rang in his ears. The man sat in bed, clutching the hospital blanket until it cracked, becoming angrier with each passing second. The image of his enemy was so vivid that the capillaries in Sahak's eyes burst with rage, and he promised to tear the hunter to pieces and send him to feed the pigs. While he was in his dreams, a low, insinuating voice was heard asking the man what kind of mess he had made in the hospital. A tall, attractive, dark-haired man stood by the bed, pushing away a glass on the floor with the toe of his shoe, and looked contemptuously at Sakak. When he was about to get out of bed to greet the guest, the brunette replied that he shouldn't get up, then smiled at the medical staff, letting them go. Turning to the patient, he quietly said that he had heard about the incident that had happened. Sahak looked down, nervously muttering that he was sorry for the mistake and that Ned shouldn't worry about what happened. The next second, a sharp dagger flew into the open mouth of the Inquisition's confidant, cutting the corners of his mouth. Ned, holding the weapon tightly in his hands, ignored Sahak's muffled groans, the low, dangerous voice telling him that everyone around him was telling him that there was no reason to worry. Sahak, swallowing bloody saliva, watched in shock at the slightest movement of the speaker's hand. Ned loudly stated that Mr. Matthias had clearly said, "Do not create problems that you will be ashamed of later." The man brought his face, darkened by quiet rage, closer to Sahak, who was numb from terrible and sudden pain, hissing that he had allowed himself to be beaten in front of a gathering of slaves. The culprit, not daring to release the sharp blade from his mouth, shook slightly, not taking his eyes off. Ned jerked his dagger out of Sahak's mouth, causing him to let out a heart-rending cry of horror. As blood dripped from the cut corners of his mouth onto the sheet, Ned added that everyone had turned a blind eye to Sahak's antics only because they had placed their hopes in him. When he first discovered the devil worshipper, Ned himself had thought that this slave had a unique talent. But over the past 6 months, including the first admirer, Sahak has found only 2. The guilty man looked ahead with despair in his eyes. Clutching his wounds with his palm, Ned continued to scold him, saying that even the top brass was starting to doubt him, and how much longer could they tolerate this whole circus? He found it hard to believe that someone like Sahak would make a mockery of the Inquisitor of Heresy's authorized representatives department. The blonde fell to the floor, hanging his head low, and began to beg the elder to give him just one chance. Ned, hands on hips, looked at the slave as if he were a despised bug, while he promised to do anything. Sahak extended his bandaged hands to Ned's feet when he suggested that they first solve the situation using their methods. The blonde fell to his knees as the elder leaned slightly over him and ordered that the one who had disgraced him be killed. And only then could he decide what punishment to impose. Sahak looked ahead, knowing that if he couldn't do even that, he would have to take off the red uniform of the Inquisition's commissioner. The elder threw Sahak a bundle of cloth tied with black thread, ordering him to use what was inside. Trembling fingers barely managed to untie the knot and open the bundle. The man's mouth opened slightly when he saw the object. In his hands were things that belonged to a devil worshipper, a dark purple ball with white veins, and a red thing with small holes along its entire length. A simple labial musical instrument. Raising his head, Sahak stuttered as he addressed the elder, but the elder interrupted him, telling him that the contents of the package had been found in the room of the devil worshipper the blonde had caught last time. It was up to Sahak to decide whether to use these things or not. Looking closely at the slave, Ned said threateningly that now was not the time when he had a choice. The blonde was told to make a decision he would not regret. Without another word, Ned walked out of the room, slamming the door loudly, leaving Sahak sitting on the floor alone. Mad Dog. Sahak himself, a public enemy of the slave hunters, had killed 26 slaves in the temple in 6 months. To return now to the status of an ordinary slave would mean dying at the hands of the slave hunters. Sahak burst into mad laughter and squeezed the purple ball in his hands. This is funny. His life has just started to improve. He has just risen from that damn bottom. It couldn't end like this, the man thought, getting up from the floor and stretching his wounded mouth into a grin. It's not he who should die, but that damned hunter. As Ned left the hospital, Sahak's mad laughter could be heard in the corridor for a long time. He just happened to be passing by a figure wrapped in bandages from head to toe. Only his eyes were watching the man closely, and he ordered him to make sure that Sahak did not do anything stupid. He was immediately told that everything would be done. Glancing sideways in the direction of the patient's room, the senior noted that a person should look at his situation objectively. Otherwise, he would be thrown out like that idiot. What kind of talent does Sahak have, dumber than an oak tree? Won't even understand that he was locked there in order to be able to create a smokescreen. Ned chuckled along with the figure, saying that the blonde should also be thanked. Thanks to Sahak's rampage, the commander of the Nightly Temple Detachment had relaxed his vigilance. He needed to secretly infiltrate the Knights' raid and steal the artifact from them. Then, eliminate the commander himself inside the dungeon. And then the third diocese of the Temple of Light would pass into the hands of the devil worshippers. Because Ned Strayer himself was an obedient disciple of the devil worshippers. Their symbol is a silhouette resembling a devil's head on an orange background, and therefore the mission was very important. In the future, it will strengthen the influence of the devilish order. Turning to the figure, Ned asked to find out more about that very hunter guy. The man noticed that he was using their sex combat technique, which only the teacher and students could use. Strayer didn't know if he was the assistant the teacher had sent, but then why didn't he contact the cult through official channels? You need to get close to this person so as not to miss anything, and Sahak is great for this. And if it turns out that the stranger is not from the sect, it will be necessary to simply eliminate him. No concessions. Anna Primrose nervously chewed her thumbnail. She had no idea that this strange client was so knowledgeable. She saw before her the corpse of a huge, real predator. He had just been transferred to the room by Jeffer from the silver room. The guy folded his arms across his chest and glanced at the stunned girl, asking what she thought about it. After coughing and expressing her rapturous admiration, the nun agreed to process the goods. Total. Sales list: Predator's corpse. 1 body. No magic stones, part of the brain and bones are destroyed. Shopping list: Divine power potion of the highest grade. 5 pieces, prayer beads filled with God's miracle, medicine. 1 piece, salamander stone. 1 piece, rental of silver alchemist's set. Grass blessed by the sun, grass blessed by the moon, deer antlers, etc. Anna said that she could find everything from the list. The main thing was money. For everything together, it would be 5,000 gold, so Jafir would have to catch 3 more predators. He nodded, replying that it was no problem. In 3 weeks, he would catch as much as he needed, so let the nun prepare the goods. The guy noticed something interesting on the shelf. A bottle of church wine made of dark glass. He suddenly had another request for Primrose. The next day, the weather was fine. There was not a single cloud in the sky. Jeffir sat at the dining table in the hunter's shelter, frowning at his new brothers. An overly pleased Goth, raising his mug of beer, suggested that they introduce themselves to each other again, despite the fact that they were all already familiar. He pointed to the smiling, kind-hearted Marco, the team's tanker, who saluted Jafir. Dale was sitting next to him. He had only been here for 3 months, but he was an excellent swordsman. The guy cast a sullen glance at the newcomer and turned away. Gott pointed at Jafir, declaring that he was the long-awaited newcomer, but the guy lowered his head and said nothing. The atmosphere at the table became tense, so Gott, pretending not to notice, raised his mug of beer again and offered to drink. He turned to his guys and made scary eyes, hinting with his whole appearance that they were acting like idiots. Because the new guy would be good for them all, they needed to improve their relationships. Marco scratched the back of his head, wondering what to do since Jeffer was also in a bad mood. He looked down at the bread and cheese on the table, guessing it was because it was unsuitable food for such a table. But it was the best they could get while they were in debt. Finally, Jeffer broke the silence by announcing that he would say everything at once. He put his hand behind his back, causing his comrades to noticeably tense up. Then he took out a bottle of wine from there, which he had begged from a nun, and slammed it down on the table, declaring that he would not drink just anything. The boy's eyes sparkled like new coins at the sight of such a treasure. It turned out that it was a gift from the White Rose, which an ordinary slave would never even dream of. The hunters clinked glasses, and Jeffer expressed hope that they would work together in the future. The guy had a plan, He helps these three earn achievements and they help him steal monster corpses. Until the raid, they are all in the same boat. The atmosphere at the table improved, except for Dale's mood, who was still frowning. The others received the newcomer quite warmly. Jafir watched the guys, since he was already on the same team with Goth in a past life. It was roughly clear what he was like. He needed a good teacher to move up. But as for the other two, they were originally supposed to be dead already, so nothing was known about them. Should Jafir train them well, or is it better to get rid of them? The warrior's gaze settled on Dale, whose face had not once smiled all evening. The corner of Jafir's lips twitched. He hid it behind a glass of wine. The guy decided that he would figure it out as he went along. Man is a creature that is benevolent to the one who gives him what he wants, to the one who loves wealth, money, to the one who thirsts for fame, success. Well, for those who strive to gain respect, well, there is no need to explain. Jafir's thoughts returned once again to the one who was that one annoying thorn in the path that he met wherever he went. Dale kept a wary, angry look at Jafir, and he was not the type to accommodate someone who was looking for conflict. The young hunter could not get used to and accept the newcomer, and he kept thinking that he did not like him at all. Even before gathering at the common table, Gott and his team decided to talk in the old composition in the barracks. The boss told the guys that they would get a huge benefit from the case. Now he has the 4th rank, and the rest have the 5th. If the rank rises, the attitude towards them will immediately change. Goth looked at the team seriously, saying that he relied on their help and asked them not to argue with the new guy. While Marco was surprised that an ordinary miner could save them and pull off the deal, Dale, still bandaged, folded his arms across his chest, frowning, and remarked that Goth had the right to receive him since he was the commander. But why didn't their commander consult with the crew in such matters? The guy thought that this idiot was just lucky. And while they were all unconscious, he pretended to catch the predator. Did Goth really believe that a useless miner could kill such a monster? Goth laughed, asking who Dale thought killed the monster. But Dale angrily exclaimed that he was more interested in the question of the deal, because if they were exposed, the entire team would go to prison, or even be executed. The loud conversation attracted the attention of the other warriors, and Marco put a finger to his lips, warning Dale that they could be heard. He said that Jafir's joining their team had long been predetermined. Moreover, they would only share the reward for the cleanup between the three of them, so it was worthwhile to just observe the new guy for a start. Remembering this conversation, Dale slammed his glass down on the table. What nonsense! Why did the guys even gather to watch? Idiots! One who calls himself a commander made the decision single-handedly, and the second sold out for a bottle of crappy alcohol. The guy looked at Jafir with a frown. No, he won't accept him. Why does some outsider come and set his own rules? Looking away, Dale smirked at his own thoughts because if the new guy was a crook, it would be revealed right away. Someone who could only talk would never last in this place. This lesson will be taught to him by the hunters themselves, and of course, by the dangerous dungeons. The entire team walked along the dry ground, their cloaks fluttering in the strong wind. Their path lay to the cave village of Edrin. This village was founded in a stone mountain and remained untouched for several hundred years. Marco, like a child, was amazed by what he saw. He said out loud that he never knew that there was such a place just 2 days' walk from the temple. It was amazing if people even lived there. Gott said with a smile that it was even cooler inside. The village had everything: a bedroom, a living room, a guest room. There was even a hotel, where those who came here on a mission or came from the temple to treat the sick stayed. The man himself also came here. Marco groaned enviously, replying that the commander should have taken him along at that time. He looked at the entrance to the cave, destroyed and completely covered in cobwebs. Now this place has become a continuous lair of monsters. Jafir was the first to enter the cave to look around and use his skill. As the rest of the team appeared from behind, torches in hand, Jafir's shadow fell upon the household goods that the people had hastily abandoned there. The warrior immediately used the magic control skill, Perception Mana. He walked along the destroyed corridor, stained with blood. The hunter knew that this skill would help improve the senses if the whole body was covered with mana. It was also possible to release mana onto the Earth's surface. Things in the detection zone, movements that occur, especially physical objects endowed with magical power, a person can feel them so clearly, as if they were all touching the skin of the person entering. Jafir moved forward carefully skirting the web, the rest of the team following behind him. Sometime later, the warriors emerged from the cave where they had been scouting and were surprised to condemn what they had seen. Dale exclaimed in shock. Surprised that there was a dark steel spider inside, Jafir replied that he could tell for sure just by looking at the tracks at the entrance. The former miner glanced around at everyone gathered, calling for them to listen to their future strategy. The guy began to draw a plan of the room in the sand with a dry branch. First, you need to move inside into the web, then get to the hole where the spiderlings are. Then you need to pour a paralyzing potion around, wait a bit, and kill everyone. When Jeffer explained that it would be difficult, since he would have to maintain perception for a long time, since spiders sleep during the day, and he would have to act carefully, he was rudely interrupted by Dale. He began to complain, gesturing discontentedly, that the problem was not whether it would be hard or easy. After all, if there really is a dark steel spider inside, the team will not be able to finish it off with just 4 people. The dark steel spider was a spider-like monster with strong iron-like skin, which had high striking power and protection that no knife could penetrate. Due to its extreme fertility, the dark steel spider reproduces incredibly quickly, putting the predator in no way near the level of danger of the spider's lair. Dale clenched his fists, adding that this was not a place that could be cleared by such a company. Let Jeffer report to the higher-ups that they would need reinforcements. He probably expected Jeffrey to be angry, but he was very surprised when he suddenly said that it was not a bad idea, because if Dale was not sure, then there was no need to go at all. The guy pretended to be a fool, easily saying that he could clear out the lair on his own. Dale didn't expect to hear something like that, but he immediately became confident in his guesses. This bastard who joined them is a common charlatan. According to his stories, he hunted the predator alone, fought with the authorized person of the heresy inquisitor Sahak. Dale had never seen any of this with his own eyes, and now this guy smugly claims that he can clear out the monster's lair. And if that's possible, why does he need the rest of the hunters? Dale smiled as he threw off his cloak as the team entered the room. The hunter concluded that the dungeon was not so dangerous. He hoped that Jeffer would not now think that the hunters would immediately listen to his every word. Now he would see how long he could pretend to be a clown. The guy, completely forgetting about safety precautions, reached for the dusty shelf and touched a thread of cobweb with his hand. The hunter immediately began to sweat from excitement and cursed under his breath. He couldn't believe that he had made such a stupid mistake. Moreover, trying to pull his hand away, Dale realized that he couldn't peel the web off himself. He began to wave his hand furiously, trying to throw the annoying substance off his glove. But then, from the darkness, small bodies with numerous pairs of yellow, glowing eyes appeared. These were the dark steel spiderlings who came running at once at the noise. Dale took a step back, grimacing in disgust at the vile creatures. The next moment, one of the hidden spiders crawled forward and, squealing loudly, jumped on him. The boy made some strange sound out of surprise as he watched the little monster fly. Jafir immediately turned in his direction. The guy found himself next to the young hunter in no time. The spiders, seeing that there was more potential food, now rushed into the air in a crowd to catch the prey. Jeffer didn't hesitate and rushed to help Dale, grabbing him by the collar of his shirt and throwing him back. The guy made another strange sound, noticing only that his left hand was without a glove. It was firmly stuck to the web. Meanwhile, the little spiderlings managed, as it seemed to them, to reach their victim, and the whole group sank their little fangs into Jeffer's hand. Several seconds passed. The warrior did not move from his place and did not even flinch, while the clicking sound was heard in the air. He was saved by a special skill for managing magic, the mana of perception, creating invisible armor over the entire surface of his body. The warrior smiled, looking at the puzzled spiders. What is this? Can't the sharp teeth bite right through? The warrior clenched his fist to grab more spiders, pulled back his other hand and swung it. The next second, he punched one particularly large spider that had latched onto his arm with all his might, the mana increasing the damage several times. Dale fell backwards, immediately trying to crawl away as spider corpses fell at his feet. Jafir loudly ordered the entire team to immediately gather together for the attack. The guys, being scattered in different corners of the hall, quickly ran up to each other. Finally, they were very close, standing in a semicircle, with their weapons held out in front of them. Now, not only small monster cubs gathered in front of the hunters, but also spiders, to put it mildly, larger ones. Their huge paws frighteningly towered over the people. The spiders also did not waste time, as if they were a single organism. They grouped together, preparing to attack. Of course, a plan is a plan. God alone knows what will happen to the hunters in the dungeon, so when the hour of battle comes, the actions have already been predetermined. For Marco, Jeffer gave his cloak and ordered the hammer to be wrapped in it. This was not the usual whim of an arrogant warrior who aimed to become a commander, but real help in battle. Dale and Goth were also told to wrap their blades in their clothes, as a regular blade would not cut the spider's threads. So at least you can remove the web from yourself with a weapon. Marco fought off the spiders, spitting webs at him with his cunningly wise hammer. The man was delighted. He had succeeded, even if the web stuck to the hammer. These creatures were weak, and he could still swing the weapon. More and more creatures were landing on Goth's blade. The man was amazed, briefly thinking how many spiders there were. Tens, hundreds, or thousands. Dale, with his eyes blinded by rage, smashed the spiders without further thought, encouraging himself with warlike cries. One particularly nimble spider managed to slip past the team's ubiquitous weapons. Like a small horse, he briskly crossed the entire perimeter of the hall. The spider's knife-sharp steel legs pierced Dale's shoulder and cut deep into his shoulder. The pale guy, looking at the splattered blood, shouted zealously, calling on the hunters to hurry. Jeffers said that if the guys managed to help him and drive all the creatures into a pile, he will be able to grind them into powder with a few blows of his fist. And indeed, with the help of mana, the small and large bodies of monsters literally exploded from the attacks of the human body. There were spider corpses scattered throughout the cave, some with missing limbs. The hunters froze in the middle of the hall. Some were sitting on the ground, some were kneeling, but they were all breathing heavily as they had managed to finish off all the monsters in this area. Dale grabbed his shoulder with a jerk and cursed under his breath, gritting his teeth. The wound was quite deep. He reproached himself for relaxing, and even for this hateful freak helping him. He was pulled out of his thoughts by the voice of the one he despised so much. Jafir handed the guy a bottle with some liquid and asked him to drink. The new guy explained to a gloomy Dale that it was a restorative mixed with medicinal herbs, something like a healing potion. The blonde was in no hurry to take what was given to him. He was immersed in self-flagellation. During the entire battle, Jafir saw right through the room. His magical perception and accuracy were simply on another level, and he knew for sure that Dale would be the first to fall into the web. The guy asked out loud if the warrior wanted to say anything. Jafir smiled, replying that anyone can make mistakes. You just need to be more vigilant next time. Of course, he noticed how Dale treated him, and while Dale, bottle in hand, looked at him angrily, the guy thought that everything wasn't so bad. In his past life, Jafir often had to train poor fighters, and there were often cases when no matter how hard the guy tried to teach them something, he still couldn't do it. However, Dale seems to have realized his mistakes and pulled himself together. At least some hope can be placed on him. Besides, with such a bad character as his, words are unlikely to help. It is better for a warrior to realize his mistakes in practice. Dave doesn't trust Jeffer now, but after clearing the dungeon, he should draw the right conclusions. Will he continue to sit outside with his tail between his legs? Or will he submit and follow the warrior? After a short rest, the time for a fierce battle against the monsters came again. While Jafir was distracting the huge spider with his dagger, Marco attacked the monster from behind. The warrior aimed the iron end of his hammer straight at the monster's belly, bypassing its tenacious paws. Goth, drenched in sweat, exclaimed triumphantly, "The paralyzing agent has restricted the spider's movements." Dale, breathing heavily, decided to attack the spider with a running start. He ran quickly, holding his sword forward. The sharp, poisonous end of the weapon sank into the flesh of the nearest spider as if through butter. The image of his involuntary teacher stood before his eyes. Jafir explained that, unlike the back, spiders have a rather soft belly. You need to aim there. Sweat poured down Dale's tense face, and he gritted his teeth, forced to admit that it was indeed as the damn newbie had said. While the blade of his sword, sprinkled with poison, was piercing the spider's wombs, the hunter continued to think about the newcomer's rightness when he talked about the habits, characteristics, and weak points of these monsters. Everything was justified, and even the way they fought. The guy suddenly pulled the sword out of the spider and got angry. How did that idiot know about everything? Letting out a war cry full of anger and indignation, Dale did not understand who that freak really was. The tense hand thrust the sword with all its might into another belly, right up to the hilt. The next moment, Dale pulled out the weapon with such force that the monster was thrown back several meters. Seeing the huge dead carcass next to Goth and Dale, Marco praised him. The hunters were overjoyed at their work. From somewhere above, Jeffer's voice was heard, saying that it was not bad for the first time, and that they needed to continue in the same spirit. His team turned and looked up, dumbfounded. The new guy, his hands hanging on his knees, was sitting on a huge, unprecedentedly high pile of dead spiders. Dave cursed. While the three of them barely finished off one creature, this guy took down a mountain of spiders. Jeffir deftly jumped to the ground, putting his hands in his pockets, and noticed that it was time for something to eat. So he asked, "Got to get some provisions." During the meal, Marco suddenly asked Jafir what he used to do. The guy replied that he was an adventurer. The hunter shook his head. That was not what he meant. but rather he wanted to ask whether the newcomer was an apprentice of a member of some major guild. Dale didn't show it, but he was also interested in listening. Jafir, having swallowed her piece, fell silent for a moment and smiled. He remembered his teacher. They were in a cave. He was sitting on the floor while Jafir was training diligently. A wary gaze followed his student from under a low-pulled hood. Jafir returned to the present, his gaze suddenly becoming sad. He abruptly changed the subject, saying that the most important thing now was that there was one room left with the spider. Marco smiled brightly, nodding, and Goth asked what the next steps were. Without answering, Jafir walked up to the spider's corpse and, to the surprised looks of the guys, cut off one of the monster's paws with a dagger. He immediately broke the limb in half at the bend, revealing green inner flesh. Now the guy was holding two spider legs in his hands, which looked like sharp battle scythes. Turning to the others, he announced that the team had had enough, and now they should get out of here. The guys, hearing this, opened their mouths as if on command and stared at Jeffer in shock. For 4 whole years, young Goth was in a group of hunters, during which time many of his comrades died, but the boy managed to survive. There is one reason for this. He always walked around the dangerous bridge, only casting wary glances into the abyss, standing on the edge, choosing only the safe path along which he could easily pass. Now, on that raid, he immediately changed tactics. It would be stupid to share with others if such a catch could bring in good money. Previously, the hunter obediently followed others, thereby losing the opportunity to get promoted. But if no one provided protection to a man, what choice did he have? Goth took Jafir's words quite calmly and agreed, thinking that from the very beginning he planned to kill the creature alone, so it would be better for the others, with such low skills, to step aside. Marco coughed and suddenly said something no one expected to hear. Since the whole team came here together, maybe they should go to the end together? Goth made scary eyes, turning to his comrade. What kind of nonsense was he talking? But he was completely stunned by the calm tone of Dale, who lazily said that he was also for it was better to be in company than alone. The commander started shaking all over, begging the boys to put their brains back in place because if they overestimated their capabilities, they could quickly end up in the next world. Staring at Jafir, the man relied on the newcomer's prudence, hoping that he would decide to dissuade the boys due to their lack of use. The newcomer closed his eyes tiredly, saying that it seemed the hunters had misunderstood him. He meant just to leave, not to leave completely because now they would be distributing responsibilities. Goth almost burst into tears from the realization that he couldn't get away from a difficult battle so easily. Finally, it was time to go meet the main spider and her subjects. Jafir was the first to head into the cave, making his way through the thick veil of cobwebs. Trying to move silently, he tried to step only on the toes of his boots. The silhouette of a guy appeared at the edge of the cave entrance. He carefully looked inside. Jafir carefully examined the room, as far as natural light in the form of holes in the ceiling allowed. There, inside, is the center of this dungeon. Human eyes, accustomed to the darkness, examined the countless small spiders around their main treasure. Here was the clutch of the dark steel spider queen, guarded by an army of monsters. An unusual-looking spider with sharp fangs on its head descended along the web. A night spider, a guardian protecting a hole for laying eggs. The spider queen herself is the mistress of the spider lair, a huge creature with a long body and steel chitin. The space around her was strewn with eggs in which future monsters with steel chitin were developing, and larvae. Jeffer strained his eyes, assessing the number of spiders he and the other hunters would have to fight. He carefully took a few steps forward, approaching the cliff. Sensing movement in the distance, a warrior spider descended from a long, sticky, and very strong web. Then, with several pairs of eyes flashing green like lanterns, the second one arrived. Noticing the dagger-like limb, Jafir stopped, realizing that this was the safest distance to approach. To ensure that the queen could lay her eggs in peace, the spider knights provided her with protection, not leaving their positions and blocking the path of anyone who dared to approach the clutch. With a disgusting, repulsive slurping sound, another egg crawled out of the spider's womb along with the internal mucus. Without looking away, Jafir extended his left hand to the side and used the ability of the silver key. Several bags fell straight out of the air onto the ground. The sacks fell on top of each other, pushing each other. They contained ordinary flour. The guy, without wasting any time, grabbed one and swung it. He threw the bag straight into the pile of spiders, and the others followed in turn. The thin fabric tore, and a huge pile of flour fell right on the spiders, raising a cloud of dust. The frightened creatures, not understanding what was happening, began to tremble in the air, fighting with an unknown enemy. The flour gradually settled on the web, landing directly on the clutch containing the spider and her offspring. In a large cloud of dust, the silhouette of Jafir appeared with a bow in his hands. The warrior raised the bow to his head and pulled the bowstring. The tip of the magic arrow glittered in the darkness. The arrow burst into flames, flew off the bow, and immediately flew down. The flight of the deadly weapon was accompanied by a loud whistle. But Jafir was not afraid that this would give him away. The arrow hit the chitinous shell of one of the spiders and bounced off to the side. A flame flared up, small at first. Hot sparks in the tightly packed flour provoke a chain reaction of spontaneous combustion. Now that the fire had spread across the entire area of the abyss, the explosion doubled in size, and it even had a name: Flower Dust Explosion. Jafir had moved away from the edge of the abyss in advance and was now running towards the exit, until huge tongues of flame rising from the bottom of the abyss began to lick his heels. However, the latter happened quite soon, and the guy had to, holding a heavy bow in his hands, speed up and run. The warrior ran, hot sparks playfully tingling his back. But Jafir was not frightened. On the contrary, he smiled at his thoughts. Of course, these bloodthirsty creatures who were now rushing about in the tongues of flame could not be finished off. The hunter knew this for sure, and hearing a furious hiss behind him, he continued to run. The fire did not harm the spider's steel shells, but only irritated them even more. Slowing down, Jafir waited for one of the knights to get closer and fired an arrow at him. Oh yes, poisonous arrows that hit the spiders right in the soft parts, causing them to roll over on their backs and fall dead. It was a powerful poison of the 72nd Poison King Fade. Number 68, Varial. The peculiarity of the poison was acute pain. More and more spiders, surrounded by tongues of flame, ran along the tunnel. Ignoring the corpses of their fellows, they continued to approach the enemy who dared to disturb the peace of their queen. Insanely fast, they jumped over each other, all in order to teach the impudent man a lesson. Suddenly, Jafir stopped and turned sharply, colliding with the jaws of a huge spider, which looked like a small hill compared to him. The spider, quickly moving its sharp paws, emerged from the turn, seeing the man. The burning creature, trying to crawl further along the tunnel, immediately got stuck in its own web. Earlier, before the battle, Jafir showed the team of hunters some kind of clot, explaining that it was the iron of a spider made of dark steel. If you squeeze it like a pastry sleeve, a web will come out. Goth asked if it would work on spiders. He was told that if there is no special enzyme on the legs, then the spiders easily stick. Goth grimaced in horror. The corners of Dale's lips crawled down in disgust, and only Marco extended his hand to take the clot. Jafir asked to scatter spiderwebs in the designated places on the way out, and then just wait outside. The thing is that the web in the royal hole is much denser, and you can't kill the monsters by fighting there, which is why you need to lure them out. A huge spider, hissing deafeningly, floundered through the burning web of its own brethren. To speed up his journey, Jafir descended the steep path on his own backside. In the left hand that activated the silver key, the very same scythe made from a severed spider leg appeared. Having comfortably adjusted the gun in his hands, Jafir first pulled it back, then forcefully pushed it forward. The tip of the improvised spear hit the spider's head right between its fangs. The guy pulled out the blade and walked along the spider's head, cutting it open. Greenish blood splashed out, and the cave shook from the monster's squeak. Taking the sharp weapon away from the disfigured monster, Jafir realized that only one spider knight remained. Suddenly, he saw something that made the warrior flinch. Another spider, even larger than the one before it, jumped out of the darkness onto the monster's corpse. He, making screeching sounds, pushed off with the help of his dagger-sharp paws, breaking through the hard shell of his dead brother. The warrior, without wasting time, hid all his weapons in the silver room and rushed forward. Hearing the scratching of fiery paws behind him, he immediately sped up, trying not to catch on the stone in the dark tunnel. His pursuer was no ordinary spider. It was the queen herself, larger and more vicious than the usual night spiders. Jafir didn't need to see to know that the monster was spitting and snapping its sharp rows of teeth, dreaming of swallowing the obnoxious man who had killed her unborn offspring. Goth, with his spear at the ready, heard loud squeaks from the tunnel and immediately shouted, calling on Jafir to run faster. Something in the queen spider's belly began to gurgle loudly. The next second, the fiend released a stream of purple light straight from its mouth. Looking back as he ran, having barely heard the sounds, Jafir understood that the spider's venom would now fly at him. They explained to him that the acidity of such venom is very high, but it is its special effect that should be feared. A curse that blocks the abilities of defense and regeneration. Even during general classes, the Poison King Fade used teaching materials to tell his students that a person with a low level of defense would melt in a matter of seconds. Slamming his fist, on which a tattoo of a snake was hidden, on the board, Fade looked at the students with his only surviving eye and exclaimed, "If you are not tired of living, you must avoid poison in every possible way." Luckily, at the last moment, Jeffer managed to run to the edge of the tunnel and push off the stone with his toe. He flew out of the darkness down like a strange bird, and right behind the warrior, from a narrow passage, a whole stream of purple poison splashed out. The guy flew down, helping himself in flight with his hands, trying to keep the drops of poison from getting on his skin. And at that time, the spider broke through the narrow passage of the tunnel, damaging him with her own body. A purple, foul-smelling liquid from the Spider Queen slowly dripped down the rocks. The still-burning monster flew out of the tunnel, as it was chasing the man too fast. Stones from the destroyed half of the tunnel fell down like a waterfall. Jafir managed to group himself and end up on the ground without any damage. Now the dark steel spider in all her glory appeared before the hunters, hissing loudly. Seeing the huge monster, Marco almost fell backwards, although he held his hammer tightly in his hands. As soon as Jeffer found himself on a solid surface, he screamed at the top of his lungs, calling on the team to stay in position. Marco, Goth, and Dave immediately reacted, gritting their teeth ready to fight. Having activated the silver key again, Jeffer ran like lightning, clutching the scythes from the limbs of the slain spider in his hands. He, being close to the spider's body, planned to attack her from above. The guy jumped up and landed on the monster's head, plunging his sharp weapon into it, then deftly slid down the shell. A deafening, pain-filled scream from the spider was heard, and green liquid spurted out of the monster's head. The queen began to thrash about, and one of her sharp paws sank into the ground, knocking Goth, who was standing nearby, aside. Meanwhile, Jafir found himself on solid ground, and standing confidently on his feet, twirled his scythes in his hands. Standing in front of the wounded spider, the boy grinned playfully, calling her to him. The creature's huge, wounded muzzle, taller than him, squealed furiously, revealing a row of razor-sharp teeth. Jeffer stood fearlessly before the spider, deciding to take on the role of tanker, as he was the only one who could compete with the queen face-to-face. He briefly thought back to the moment when he had explained the strategy to the hunters and their commander before the battle. While the warrior diverts attention to himself, the others chop down the creature and finish it off. This caused genuine surprise in the guys, which was immediately reflected on their faces. Goth's hands, clutching the weapon, began to shake. All this time he had lived because he had avoided the dangerous bridge, because he considered his life priceless. And now, faced with such an unprecedented danger, the hunter's entire being was overcome with uncertainty. Looking at his team, those whose commander he was, the man remembered that he tried not to expose them to mortal danger by not working at full capacity. And now, raising his head to see the spider in full growth, the main question arose before Goth. Would he be able to overcome such a giant? Large beads of sweat ran down Dave's face from tension and fear. The guy clenched his teeth so as not to give away his condition. But his thoughts were still somewhere in the past. A group of senior hunters turned their attention to the newcomers, ordering them to quickly prepare dinner and polish their equipment. When Goth grimaced and replied that his team were the same hunters, the groups of offenders laughed contemptuously. Let them stop talking nonsense. They are not fighting, so let them go cook food. At least there should be some benefit from them. Now Dale cursed to himself, remembering his own feelings at that moment. How long would they tolerate such a shitty attitude towards themselves? Proudly raising his head in the face of danger, the boy firmly decided that the hunters now had nothing to fear because they had come such a long way. Leaning forward, he swung his sharp sword. They can and will fight no matter what. Goth, seeing the unprecedented determination on the blonde's face, was very surprised. Marco also withdrew into himself for a moment, lowering his head, lost in doubt. Initially, the hunting team would not even dare to go against such a monster. The events of the last few hours have proven otherwise, and even unexpectedly for themselves, the guys have gathered their spirits. They found somewhere inside their souls an extraordinary power and desire for life, for victory. And it's all thanks to Jafir. After his appearance, something changed forever. Up until that point, everything had been going perfectly if the team followed Jafir's words, so it was definitely worth trusting him again. Straightening up, Marco, calling the others forward, shouted loudly that they could do anything. Goth, in despair, slapped his palm across his face. Damn it, these guys don't even listen to their own commander. This made him feel incredibly ashamed. And now he couldn't just stand aside, so he screamed loudly and rushed forward, straight at the monster. Goth remembered well Jafir's instruction to strike at that crucial moment when the outer layer of the shell cracked from the explosion. For a moment, the queen was distracted by another warrior, and this gave Goth an advantage to attack. The man, having tried to thrust his spear into the spider, immediately warned the others that the creature was not so impenetrable inside. Only the outer layer of the shell was strong. Marco grinned, pulled the dagger out of its sheath and rushed forward, quickly finding the monster's weak spot with his gaze. The sharp steel penetrated the monster's soft tissues like butter, and green, stinking blood spurted out. Marco quickly put the dagger back in its sheath and armed himself with his hammer again. The spider's severed womb took the warrior's heavier blows. Jafir had previously shown his comrades the naked flesh of the spider. The guy pointed to the nerve bundle running along the center of the paws and advised them to aim there. As Jafir had said, Dale was now cutting that spot with a blade that was well lubricated with paralyzing poison. The sword entered halfway into the monster's flesh, and the boy rejoiced, letting out a cry of victory. But unfortunately, things didn't go according to his plan when he pulled out his sword and suddenly raised his head. A net of dangerous web was already falling on him from above, ready to grab a man. Like a fly, Dale was paralyzed. He realized that he would not have time to dodge. Jafir came to his aid, descending from somewhere above, furiously waving his weapon. The warrior jumped on the spider's head, stunning her for a moment with a powerful blow, saliva spraying from the creature's mouth. This bought time for Dale, who screamed and managed to jump to the side, and the web that the queen released did not touch him. Jafir, stopping not far from the monster's mouth, immediately boldly called on her to look only at him. The spider, her remaining eyes flashing, bared her teeth again and squealed angrily. Jafir, once again fearing nothing, rushed towards the enemy, waving his scythes. There was a fierce fight between him and the spider. The angry mother rushed at the man, but he did not allow himself to be offended. Dale watched this fight and admired the skills of Jafir, who repelled absolutely all attacks of the Spider Queen. The hunter even had a hard time following his movements. And just a few hours ago, Dale looked at Jafir as if he was crazy, assuring that 3 hunters did not have enough strength to kill this monster. Jafir interrupted him, assuring him that as long as he, the one who burned the spider eggs, was in front of the queen, she, in a fit of anger, would pay practically no attention to what was happening behind her. Raising his index finger up, the guy added, "More importantly, the Black Steel Spider Queen has one unusual feature." Dale made sure that everything was as Jafir said. About 5 minutes had already passed since the start of the fight. The Spider Queen barely moves from the place where she fell after running out of the tunnel. Because the queen spider produces her offspring in a small egg-rearing room, she has a habit of moving her hind legs very little, so it is quite safe to be in this area. And how did Jafir have such incredibly effective and truthful knowledge for an ordinary newbie? After all, with the exception of a web or stamp attack, the most effective blows will be delivered to an enemy that is right in front of the spider's eyes. Jafir was used to this type of combat pattern when he fought the large spiders inside the dungeon. Dale understood that now, while the newcomer was distracting the queen's attention, he needed to immobilize her with a paralyzing poison, and the death of the monster would only be a matter of time. Marco was now more confident than ever, swinging the sledgehammer that they could do it. Goth, gritting his teeth and covered in the spider's blood, convinced himself that they would succeed. The tip of his poisoned spear struck the queen's open wound, coating her insides with poison. The enraged creature sharply raised its wounded paw upward, pulling Goth, who was hanging on his own spear, along with it. He screamed in fear when he found himself at a fairly decent height. The spear was firmly stuck in someone else's flesh. But the spider saw only one enemy she hated in front of her, and, spitting saliva, she hissed loudly. This only seemed to excite Jafir as he looked at the monster's sharp fangs. The spider pushed off the ground with her hind legs and began to furiously attack the human being. With this movement, Goth's spear slipped from her body, and he fell to the ground from a great height with screams. The queen fought to the last. She will not forgive the pathetic people who dared to touch her children. The glands with her purple poison on her belly opened up again. She decided that the poison would kill their bodies slowly and painfully. Jafir's palm appeared in the air as if from nowhere, and he purposefully stretched it forward. Unexpectedly for the spider, he leaned forward and with one hand grabbed the fang, and with the other he plunged it straight into her stomach. Making his way through the streams of green blood, the boy felt the poisonous gland in his neck and grabbed it. Satisfied that he had a firm grip, Jafir twisted his clenched fist with all his might. The warrior's forehead was bulging with the incredible strain, but he knew he had to be strong. After pausing for a moment, Jafir pulled on the iron, pulling it out. He immediately grabbed the belt buckle and unfastened it. Holding the iron tightly with one hand, he tugged at one end of the belt. The next step was to tie the gland with a belt. The guy did it sharply, without delay. Thanks to these manipulations, the spider will not be able to use poison for several minutes. Leaving the iron dangling outside the queen's body, Jafir grabbed the weapon and ran along her body, jumping up. Once in the air, The warrior knew where he had to land. There was nothing to worry about. The spider, at first confused and having lost sight of her prey, the next minute saw him right above her head with her two surviving eyes. Jafir dropped to the spot between her eyes, kicking there with all his might with the heel of his boot. There was no need to rush in such a matter, only precision was important. The guy's intense gaze bored into the spider, just as she bored into him. The rest of the hunting team also kept a close eye on them. The one who stays focused will win this battle. The midday sun illuminated the huge carcass of the spider, from which the hunters slowly but surely separated the massive legs. The creature, the size of a mountain, was dead, and the hunters happily congratulated each other on their victory. They had succeeded. But Dale, wiping the sweat from his forehead, looked attentively at Jeffer, standing in the distance. The guy thought that this victory had nothing to do with him, Marco and Goth, no matter how much he didn't want to admit it. After all, the one who finished off the monster was precisely Jeffer, a newcomer to their team, who was now examining the dead spider, his scythe thrown over his shoulder. Dale finally realized that the hunt and its success depend on who leads it. Looking at Jafir, who was about to cut up the carcass, he thought about what would happen if he followed the new guy. Meanwhile, Jeffer himself was thinking about what to do with the dead queen. He wouldn't be able to remove her traces, and he wouldn't be able to take her away entirely, as he had with the predator. Several captured spiders could be given to the White Rose. When he decided that he would take only the most necessary things from the spider, he heard his name being called. Turning around, he was embarrassed to see how Dale, who had recently been glaring at him, was now politely spreading out a travel bag so that Jeffer could rest. He tiredly drank water from his canteen, watching Dale convince him that he could butcher monsters and criticize the other hunters for their hesitation. Having quenched his thirst, Jafir thought contentedly that, due to the fact that he had fought with the group, he had managed to save a decent amount of mana, so there was no need to worry about being subject to Usra's debt collection during the hunt. Looking at the other hunters who were happily cutting up the spider's carcass, laughing and arguing among themselves, the guy decided that these three weren't so bad. Jafir suddenly became serious, realizing that this was where their journey together would end. The guys certainly won't be able to boast of their strength and ability to fight in a battle against a strong enemy. Putting the flask cap back in place, the guy thought that there was currently a severe shortage of skill levels, equipment, and team members. It is absolutely necessary to look for a way out. Some kind of countermeasure is needed. The entire team of hunters, having collected their catch, returned to the city after a successful hunt. The first thing Jeffer did was go to the monster broker Anna Primrose, or rather, to the Nun of the Temple of Light. The girl was delighted to receive such a valuable specimen, a real predator. The guy handed her a heavy bag of money, saying that he had put a little more in there so that this money would go to good use. The happy nun greeted the next customer, saying that the goddess also saw his piety, and asked if he had brought enough bags of subspace. Jeffer silently watched from the sidelines the scene of illegal trade in broad daylight in the temple of the goddess. But even now, no one believed that the temple was exclusively a place for the ministers of the church. The money that the believers donate to the temple is collected over the years, and the temple was built next to the city so that the knights of the temple and the battle slaves could destroy monsters. The warrior chuckled and thought that safety was worth paying for. At least now it could be bought with money. It seemed that soon it would even become a problem to sell one's own life in exchange for the safety of one's children. Jafir and Anna left the temple. The sun was gradually setting behind the horizon. There was warmth in the air, and the singing of evening birds could be heard. The girl said that her client was very lucky. The buyers of the predator and the spiders showed up on time. All the monsters were in excellent condition, so they were sold at a good price. White Rose winked at the guy, continuing to chirp about how she found it hard to believe the sale was so quick. But Jeffer interrupted her, asking how things were with the money. The corners of the girl's lips turned down. She said that the guy was a bore, but then launched into a dry analysis. 48% of the intended amount, 20% would be deducted from the profit, which would be returned to the temple as payment for the debt. Then Anna stunned the guy by handing him a suit and a card to enter the laboratory, where Jeffrey was signed up to clean. Lightly tapping her notebook on her chin, the nun thoughtfully said that the chemical equipment was quite large and very valuable, so they wouldn't lend it to the warrior just like that. At 7 in the evening, everyone leaves the laboratory. It's entirely at the client's disposal. Jeffer smiled lightly. This option was much safer than stealing quietly. There were always few people to clean the lab, so he would go there today. The guy said out loud, shrugging his shoulders, that since there was no other way, there was nothing to be done, and Primrose, laughing, said that the client was entitled to an hourly rate for this. A voice was heard behind them, saying that he had finally found the nun. Turning slowly, Jeffer saw Ned Strayer. He asked the girl to give him some time to talk. The man's impassive face was hard to read, and he smiled affably at the couple. Jeffer, however, was not so calm. He cursed under his breath, unable to accept the fact that he had the misfortune of meeting his enemy at just such a moment. The confidant of the Inquisition is Ned. Among the 12 confidants, he is the only one considered a first-class fighter who has received recognition from the temple itself. This was the official information about the man in this world. But for Jafir, he was someone else. Anna Primrose laughed lightly and did not expect to see Ned here. He was not going to invite her on a date, probably to consult about a loan. But she was a little busy right now. The girl was playing. She knew that the man's target was her client, since Ned was Sahak's boss, who had been disgraced by Jeffer. She expected that these idiots would want to get even with the client and would come up with something original. What an impudent fellow! He wants to fight right in front of the temple priest. In a quiet voice, Anna suggested to Ned that they chat later, and she would offer goods at low interest rates since the temple trusted him. But the man did not calm down, pretending that he did not understand the hints and persistently asked to be received, even promising to treat him to tea. When he invited Jafir to join him, he stepped forward, shielding Anna from her rival with his hand. Raising an eyebrow, Strayer lazily asked the guy if he knew their Sahak. The warrior lowered his head and smiled, asking to clarify who it was, citing his old age and the fact that he doesn't remember all sorts of rubbish. Ned narrowed his eyes but kept smiling as he looked at Jeffer. He returned a sly look and was not embarrassed under the man's attentive gaze. They were too close to each other. The air sparkled. Two multicolored forces collided with an explosion on the spiritual side. This frightened the birds flying past, and Anna, grabbing her shoulders, leaned back, feeling how their magic seemed to penetrate deep under her skin. So powerful was the energy. She was not stupid. The girl immediately understood that Jeffer's level was not similar to that of a combat slave. Most likely it would be close to the Knights of the Temple. Ned Strayer was of the same opinion, looking with a grin at the slave frozen in front of him. Even just standing next to him, the man understood why Sahak didn't just walk past the guy. Of course, he didn't come here to fight, but why not miss the opportunity? Taking a fighting stance, Ned's body glowed red. He decided to have some fun once. Jafir was not far behind. Blue energy engulfed this entire body, but their plans were not destined to come true. The time for battle had not yet come. So decided Anna Primrose, who had been standing aside until then. She shouted in a loud voice, unusual for her, ordering the men to kneel. The girl extended her hand, from which a golden beam burst forth. Ned and Jeffrey, who had almost collided in a fight, froze in place. It was all about the slave mark, a slave mark that the priests of light leave at their discretion within the scope of their authority. There was one on the shoulder of both warriors. A priest can force obedience on someone he has branded, and that is what Anna did. The symbols on Ned and Jeffrey immediately lit up with a bright light, even through the thick fabric of their clothes. Against their will, the men slowly sank to their knees in front of the nun, the tangible energy of both of them gone. An angry Anna, as soon as the men calmed down, approached Jafir. Her blonde hair scattered across her face as she swung. The girl's palm landed very accurately on the warrior's cheek with a slap so strong that his head swung to the side. Like a naughty little dog, the nun grabbed Jeffer by the collar and led him away, shouting that he was an idiot and had forgotten where he was. Was he really tired of living, and that he should be taught a lesson? As she walked without turning around, she called out to Ned, who was standing silently. Turning her head, the air around Primrose became electric as she warned that the boy was her plaything and she would turn anyone into a chop if they laid a finger on him. Ned bowed low, only grinning and saying nothing. When the strange couple had moved far enough away and turned the corner, the nun was able to relax. She sank down onto the stairs and dropped her face into her palms, lamenting that the client had succumbed to the provocation of a dangerous guy, and her hands were still shaking. Anna explained that Strayer is a first-class confidant, meaning he is very strong. Almost no one knows how he fights. Well, everyone who saw and felt this for themselves has long been dead. She suddenly jumped up and flew up to Jeffir, who was calmly standing by the wall, shouting that she would soon die from her client's adventures. And if something happened to her book of expenses and income, then the guy would go to his forefathers. Finally, the girl finished her speech and exhaled angrily, frowning. Unexpectedly for Jeffer, the nun reached out with her palm to his aching cheek and ran her fingertips over the skin. The sharp anger quickly gave way to tenderness, and the girl quietly asked the warrior to act more carefully, because outside the temple she would be able to protect him. Baring his teeth, Jafir easily pushed her hand aside, saying that this could be called a warm greeting. If that guy was really going to do something, the nun wouldn't have had time to intervene. The guy threw his uniform over his shoulder, and when Anna asked where he was going, he answered that he was going to the laboratory. Since his opponent had shown himself, the preparations were almost finished, and it was time for Jeffrey to hurry up too. He stopped abruptly, as if he had forgotten to say something important. Turning his head, the guy asked to fulfill one more request. Anna grimaced, realizing that her client wasn't going to stop at the first one. Meanwhile, Ned Strayer rose from his knees and patted his knees to get rid of the dust, cursing as he realized the power of the brand. Ned grinned evilly, trying not to let go of the raging anger at what he felt on himself. Even when he was with his teacher, a tall man with long blue hair who painted right on the floor with a huge brush, Ned did not expect to hear those words from him. The teacher wanted his student to go to the temple and become a slave, allowing himself to be branded with shame. Strayer, pressing his hand to his chest, exclaimed that he hated these scumbags, but the long-haired man, without turning around, abruptly interrupted him, calling him by name. The disciple was dumbfounded when he heard that 2 followers of the devil, whom they had sent to the temple under the false status of priests, had been repressed. Continuing to draw symbols on the floor, the teacher said that the checks on priests have increased, and those who have not yet been exposed avoid risky actions. This method will no longer work. The brush left a long black line on the paper, however, there was still a way out. The priests of light do not monitor the slaves they have branded. They make the mistake of thinking that the mark is already sufficient for control. The teacher stopped and turned to his student. He needed to take advantage of this miscalculation, have Ned brand himself, enter the temple, and steal the reward from the raid dungeon. The man said that only Strayer could complete this mission successfully. The priests of light will never know that they have found a way to disarm the brand. Grabbing his shoulder, where the cross he hated was hidden under his clothes, Ned understood that he could not use it now. He had to wait until the time came. And then the vile priest will pay for all their sins. Around a small village, residents cheerfully and amicably built a wooden fence. The women set the table right on the street and now called the men to dinner. The workers, rubbing their backs, talked among themselves. Every half-month the damn fence breaks down. Such poor areas cannot afford protection from the temple. They have to put up such a fence. One of them started cursing at himself, shouting that he would kill the damn monsters if they came here. The cry of a sentry was heard, announcing that someone from the temple was approaching the village. The wounds from Ned's dagger had long since healed at the corners of Sahak's lips, leaving him with jagged scars as a memento. The man, with his head held high, looked around and walked towards the entrance to the village, where the workers, taking off their hats, hesitantly asked him what he was doing in such a rundown area. Sahak, without any preludes, abruptly asked the resident how many people lived in the village, and he timidly replied that there were a little more than 50. The Inquisitor's agent grinned, replied that it suited him, and grabbed the red object he had received from Ned. Sahak brought it to his mouth and began to play a melody on the simple musical instrument. Right behind him, something huge burst out from under the ground. A bunch of faces with eyes and sharp teeth molded into one creature. Long tentacles with teeth at the ends reached out to the inhabitants, frozen in horror. These tentacles cut people into pieces. The men's heads flew off to the side. The blood was boiling, splashing around in rivers, and in the center of this madness stood the laughing Sahak. The slave's bloody palm reached forward. Then he squeezed it hard. This was his new power. How painful it was to remember what incredible shame he had suffered. How smugly that damn miner walked away after the battle, leaving him bleeding right in the center of the square. Sahak's eyes turned bloodshot at the mere memory. He would never forgive this bastard. He would pay for everything. The man laughed, louder and louder, as the underground monster destroyed an entire village by the dozens, tearing its inhabitants apart. Night had fallen. The moon illuminated the roof of the Temple of Light Laboratory, a place of research and creation of equipment and potions. So, the list of ingredients: green grass remains, moldy bark of the Leda tree, secretion of rotten cobalt. Then find a gray centipede and cadaver mushrooms on the shelves. You need to mix all these reagents and boil them in a curved flask. Japhir, observing safety precautions, wearing gloves, an apron, and a cloth that only revealed his eyes, held with tongs a flask with poison, number 61 Zagan, from the 72 potent poisons of King Fade. Having finished their work in the laboratory, Jeffrey and Anna returned to the nun's abode. The girl sat on the bed with a sheet of paper in her hands and watched as her client, bare-chested, did something with a log and a dagger. She rolled her eyes, remembering that Jeffrey had asked her for temporary shelter so that Ned's henchmen wouldn't find him. To all of Anna's excuses, he reminded her that she had promised to protect her client from the temple. Now it's not enough for her to have to let a man she barely knew into her cell. Now she was studying something strange. On the sheet of paper, there was a silhouette of a man with dots all over his body, and each had its own meaning. Jeffir himself made cuts with a dagger on the steel-like wood of the Archon. Having finished his preparations, he used his special abilities, summoning a clot of energy onto his palm. The next moment, the guy suddenly hit the log with his palm, breaking it into pieces. When the large pieces fell away, only thin wooden needles remained on the floor, which the warrior cut out with a dagger. Anna approached the client with interest, tucking her hair behind her ear, and asked Jeffrey why he had cut the log. The guy, burning the needles he had received over a candle, explained that these needles he had received served as a medical device in the East. The guy dipped the needles into the poisons Belial and Zagan, diluted 1 to 100, and then left them for 10 minutes. But poison is an incredibly simple thing, just a substance for weakening and killing. That's exactly what everyone thinks. When the wooden needles were soaked with poison, the guy began to carefully pull them out of the container. Who would have known that after the invasion of hellish creatures and the seizure of power by the gods, people would begin to rely on poisons? Jafir took a deep breath, then exhaled noisily, and grabbing one needle stuck it into his shoulder. Within seconds, the guy, who had sweat pouring down his entire body, already had 10 needles on him. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair was wet, but the guy knew why he was doing it. A hissing sound came through his clenched teeth, and green veins of poison appeared all over his torso, which was covered in needles. When he started vomiting blood, Anna, who had been sitting on the bed in fear, ran towards the client screaming. But Jeffir stopped her abruptly, holding out his hand, and the girl was dumbfounded. Before the procedure began, the warrior strictly ordered her not to faint, no matter what he would do, and when he gave the signal, she had to do everything exactly according to plan. Primrose asked excitedly what Jeffir was going to do and what she meant. The guy grinned. He needed to gain fat, become stronger and more resilient. 72 powerful poisons of fade, depending on their concentration, can become completely different substances. If you correctly calculate the degree of saturation and cause the effect of resistance, the poison will turn into a medicine, one that can raise skills beyond their limits. Hands with green veins rested on knees. Jeffir was breathing heavily. The problem was in the combination of poisons. Belial caused acute pain, and Zagan, abrupt changes in the body. Resistance falls behind the hellish pain. The boy, swallowing his own blood, knew that he didn't have the materials or skill level to make a stable potion. There was no other choice. He sat cross-legged and did not dare move, because it was important to leave the needles in the right position. And the required position was called the small celestial circle. The needles themselves were stuck into the body along the entire perimeter, forming a circle. This is one of the Eastern methods of Qigong. Through the acupuncture points of the upper body, there is a circulation of magical power. It is possible to restore internal damage by controlling the flow of magic, or through training to raise this level. By channeling magical energy through the small celestial circle, Jafir resists poison, and if successful, his skills will reach a new level. If nothing works out, his body will fall apart. The guy closed his eyes, thinking that there was nothing terrible about it. It was neither agony nor suffering, especially when compared to what happened in his past. When Jeffir fought against powerful enemies, losing his family and friends, when Tartaros won by plunging cold steel into human flesh, and although the Demon King often appears in his thoughts, haunts him in his dreams, and does not allow him to relax for a second. Jeffir has himself and a chance to change everything forever. Immersed in everything and nothing, Jafir's body began to exude magical energy. The nun, obediently standing to the side, looked at her client's body in amazement. After some time, the color of his veins returned to normal. Jafir, among other things, ordered the girl to monitor his condition because he might not be able to move. And when he gives a signal, you will need to stick the remaining needles into the marked places. The boy slowly turned his head and asked White Rose if she was ready to do it now. Anna, her eyes wide open, carefully picked up the needle. She needed to stick it into the client's head. The nun raised her hand above her head. It was better not to ask what would happen in case of failure. Death. Now beads of sweat were running down her forehead from the tension of the situation. What should she do? Will it work out? Outside the window, meanwhile, the darkness of the night was slowly disappearing, leisurely letting the morning dawn pass ahead. A few hours later, near the northern forest, not far from the Temple of Light, a red flash appeared in the still blue-black star-studded sky. The next second, the flash turned into a burning red cross with a circle in the center, and the silence of the night was killed by someone's screams. A flock of numerous sharp-beaked and very large monster birds rushed forward. A team of 3 hunters tried to escape from her, clutching weapons in their hands. They urged each other on. The man with an axe in his hands cursed the reconnaissance squad as he walked, wishing them all a break, because they said that the monsters had only one nest, but there were several dozen of them there. The red cross continued to burn brightly in the sky. When the hunter in the long black cloak asked for help, his partner in the red cap shouted that he had fired a flare and that reinforcements should arrive quickly. He barely had time to say which way they should run when a huge beak grabbed the man, immediately breaking his fragile human neck. The hunter with the axe suffered the same fate, and the only slave left untouched screamed shrilly, begging the heavens for help. His cloak fluttered in the wind. The man knew that there were about 5 kilometers left to the temple. Even with good visibility, the journey would take another 20 minutes. Something terrible happened. His boot caught on the rocks. The hunter realized that he was about to fall flat on his face. Loud curses shook the air. The man found himself on the floor, his knees resting on sharp stones, breathing heavily. Sweat poured into his eyes, but he decided to slowly turn his head, knowing that in 2 minutes there would be nothing left of him. The birds, stretching out their long necks, towered over what they considered to be the most delicious breakfast. They flashed their eyes predatorily and hesitated, as if giving their victim time. Not daring to make the slightest movement, the unfortunate slave stared at the monsters with all his eyes. The next second, the bird that ran closest to him opened its mouth and reached out to the man. He screamed and, expecting death, covered his face with his shield. The man did not open his eyes, knowing that only a miracle could save him from a terrible death. Meanwhile, the birds were being pierced by bright blue energy beams, cutting them into pieces. The hunter suddenly raised his head and opened his mouth in shock when he saw this energy. He managed to roll to the side when something fell loudly from the sky next to him, raising a cloud of dust. In that place, with his fist pressed into the ruined earth, stood Jafir on one knee. With his new strength and replenished energy reserves, thanks to the needles and the Eastern method of Qigong, the guy slowly raised his eyes with fury in his gaze, examining the monsters. The birds, noticing the new prey, rushed in a flock with deafening cries towards the lonely man. Jafir deftly dodged the first sharp beak that caught him. He grabbed the monster's feathered body with both hands, and it let out a surprised squeak. The next moment, spreading its arms, the monster screamed in pain because the man's unusually powerful mana sharply twisted its neck. Without the slightest hesitation, Jafir grabbed the powerful beak to tear the bird's head out of its body the next moment, pulling out a long, bloody spine. The rest of the birds gathered in front of the warrior, watching as the man brandished the remains of one of their flock. Jafir quickly calculated that there were 12 remaining monsters, and only 12 winged spines. Just a day ago, he had never even dreamed of what he was planning to do right now. Concentrating, the warrior generated 12 beams of energy and fired them at the birds, turning their bodies into a sieve. The surviving hunter lay on his back and looked at the stranger as if he were a deity descended from heaven. The man's gaze darted over the strong body. Finally, he saw the symbol of the temple. Did reinforcements really come so quickly? And he was alone? The hunter did not immediately hear Jafir's question about where the temple was, and for a few more seconds he turned his head in stunned silence. Somehow standing up, he pointed with a trembling hand straight ahead in the direction he needed to go along the road. Jafir replied that it was good and literally disappeared from the hunter's sight, leaving behind a white flash. This seemed to frighten and puzzle the man even more than the flock of monster birds he had discovered.